An arthritic 78-year-old offered to sketch his victims. 93 portraits later, the FBI realized he was America's deadliest serial killer. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the sterile interview room at the Wise County Jail in Decatur, Texas, casting harsh shadows across the weathered face of the man who would become known as America's most prolific serial killer. Samuel Little, 78 years old and confined to a wheelchair, his once powerful hands now gnarled with arthritis, leaned forward toward the FBI analysts with an almost eager expression. It was October 2018, and what began as a routine cold case interview would soon unravel into the most extensive serial killer confession in American history. "I can draw them," Little said, his voice carrying the gravelly remnants of decades of cigarettes and hard living. "I remember all their faces. They're the only thing I never forgot." FBI crime analyst Christina Palazzolo watched as Little's arthritic fingers gripped a colored pencil with surprising steadiness. The sketch that emerged was hauntingly detailed. A young black woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, her hair styled in the fashion of the early 1980s. The drawing would later be identified as one of Little's victims from Cincinnati, a woman whose disappearance had gone largely unnoticed by law enforcement 40 years earlier. This was the beginning of what would become known as the Little Files. Over 700 hours of recorded confessions and dozens of sketches that would ultimately link Samuel Little to at least 93 murders spanning from 1970 to 2005, making him the deadliest serial killer in American history. But perhaps more disturbing than the sheer number of his victims was the systematic way society had failed to protect them, and how Little had exploited every crack in the system to prey upon the most vulnerable. Samuel McDowell Little was born on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia, to a 16-year-old mother who would abandon him to his grandmother's care before he was even walking. His grandmother, Bessie Little, moved the family to Lorain, Ohio, where young Samuel would spend his formative years in a household marked by instability and neglect. The industrial city, with its steel mills and racial tensions, provided the backdrop for Little's early education in violence and manipulation. By age 16, Little had already developed the behavioral patterns that would define his criminal career. He was arrested for burglary in 1956, the first of what would become a staggering array of charges over the next 5 decades. But it was his treatment of women that provided the earliest warning signs of the monster he would become. Multiple arrests for assault, attempted rape, and domestic violence created a paper trail that, in hindsight, reads like a blueprint for his later crimes. Little possessed an unusual combination of physical attributes that made him particularly dangerous. Standing 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighing over 200 pounds during his prime, he had the build of a boxer, which he had been, fighting in amateur matches throughout the 1960s. His hands, developed through years of training and manual labor, were unusually large and powerful. These hands would become his signature weapon, capable of crushing a human windpipe with terrifying efficiency. But it was Little's psychological profile that made him truly lethal. Unlike many serial killers who operate within specific geographic boundaries, Little was a nomad, drifting from city to city, state to state, leaving a trail of death that law enforcement agencies would fail to connect for decades. He had an uncanny ability to identify and target society's most vulnerable members. Women working in prostitution, drug addicts, transgender individuals, and those experiencing homelessness. These were people whose disappearances often went unreported, whose deaths were frequently attributed to drugs or lifestyle choices rather than murder. The systematic nature of Little's victim selection reveals a calculating intelligence that many investigators initially underestimated. He deliberately chose women who existed on society's margins, understanding that their deaths would receive minimal police attention. This wasn't random violence. It was strategic predation that exploited America's deepest social inequalities. Little's first confirmed murder occurred in 1970 in Miami, Florida. Mary Jo Brosley, a white woman in her early 30s, was found strangled in her apartment. The crime scene showed signs of a struggle, but with limited forensic technology available at the time, investigators had few leads to pursue. Little had already left the city by the time Brosley's body was discovered, beginning a pattern of mobility that would characterize his entire criminal career. Throughout the 1970s, Little's killing pattern established itself with horrifying consistency. He would arrive in a new city, often traveling by Greyhound bus or hitchhiking, and quickly identify areas where vulnerable women could be found. His approach was methodical. He would spend time observing potential victims, learning their routines, and identifying the safest opportunities to strike. In 1975, Little was in Homestead, Florida, when he encountered Melinda Rose LaPree, a 22-year-old woman struggling with addiction. LaPree had been reported missing by her family, but local police initially treated her disappearance as a runaway case. Her body was found weeks later in a canal, but the cause of death was listed as drowning. It would be over 40 years before investigators would connect her murder to Samuel Little. The 1980s marked the height of Little's killing spree, coinciding with the crack cocaine epidemic that devastated urban communities across America. The chaos and desperation of this period provided Little with an abundant supply of vulnerable victims. He moved through cities like Cincinnati, Cleveland, Phoenix, and Los Angeles, leaving a trail of bodies that law enforcement agencies failed to connect. In Cincinnati, Little targeted women in the Over-the-Rhine neighborhood, an area plagued by poverty and drug addiction. Between 1981 and 1984, he killed at least 4 women in the city, including the woman whose sketch he would draw decades later in that Texas jail cell. The Cincinnati Police Department, overwhelmed by drug-related violence and lacking the resources for thorough investigations, often classified these deaths as overdoses or accidental deaths. Little's methodology was both brutal and calculated. He would approach potential victims with offers of money, drugs, or simply a ride to a different location. Once isolated, he would engage in violent sexual assault before strangling his victims with his bare hands. The strangulation was never quick or impersonal. Little later described to investigators how he would watch his victims' faces as they died, deriving sexual pleasure from their terror and suffering. After killing his victims, Little would dispose of their bodies in remote locations, abandoned buildings, wooded areas, or bodies of water. He possessed an intimate knowledge of urban geography, understanding which locations were least likely to be discovered by police. Many of his victims' bodies were never found, contributing to the difficulty investigators faced in connecting his crimes. The psychological profile that emerged from Little's confessions revealed a killer who combined sexual sadism with a complete lack of empathy for his victims. He described them to investigators not as human beings, but as objects that existed for his pleasure. This dehumanization was particularly evident in his treatment of victims who were black, reflecting the deep-seated racism that permeated both Little's worldview and the broader society that failed to protect his victims. Dr. Catherine Ramsland, a forensic psychologist who studied Little's case, noted that his ability to compartmentalize his crimes was extraordinary. He could commit a brutal murder in the morning and spend the afternoon playing cards with friends, showing no signs of distress or unusual behavior, she observed. This level of psychological dissociation is what allowed him to continue killing for decades without detection. The 1990s brought changes to both Little's methodology and the law enforcement landscape. DNA technology was beginning to revolutionize criminal investigations, and agencies were starting to develop more sophisticated approaches to serial killer investigations. However, Little adapted to these changes by becoming even more selective in his victim choice, and more careful about leaving physical evidence. In 1994, Little was arrested in connection with the murders of 3 women in Los Angeles. The case seemed strong. There was physical evidence linking him to the crimes, and witnesses had seen him with the victims. However, the prosecution's case fell apart when key witnesses failed to appear in court, and Little was acquitted on all charges. This near miss seemed to embolden him, and he continued killing well into the 2000s. The failure of the Los Angeles prosecution highlighted systemic problems in how law enforcement agencies handled cases involving marginalized victims. Defense attorneys successfully argued that the victims' lifestyles made them unreliable witnesses, while prosecutors struggled to present compelling cases to juries who often harbored their own prejudices about the victim's worthiness of justice. Little's final confirmed murder occurred in 2005 in Tupelo, Mississippi. By this time, he was 65 years old, and his physical capabilities were declining. Age and decades of heavy drug use had taken their toll, and he was no longer the imposing figure who had terrorized victims across the country. However, his psychological need to kill remained as strong as ever. The end of Little's killing career came not through brilliant detective work or forensic breakthroughs, but through a relatively mundane arrest for drug possession in Kentucky in 2000-2012. During routine processing, his DNA was entered into the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, where it matched samples from 3 unsolved murders in California dating back to the 1980s. Detective Mitzi Roberts of the Los Angeles Police Department was assigned to the cold case unit when Little's DNA matches came to light. Roberts, an experienced investigator with a reputation for thorough case preparation, began building the prosecution's case against an aging serial killer who had evaded justice for over 4 decades. When I first saw Little's criminal history, I knew we were dealing with someone who had been flying under the radar for years, Roberts later recalled. But I had no idea we were looking at the most prolific serial killer in American history. The prosecution's case was built on a combination of DNA evidence, witness testimony, and circumstantial evidence linking Little to the California murders. In 2014, Little was convicted of 3 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was transferred to the California State Prison in Lancaster, where he would spend the remainder of his life. It was during his incarceration that FBI crime analyst Christina Palazzolo began the interviews that would ultimately uncover the full scope of Little's crimes. Palazzolo, who had specialized in cold case investigations for over a decade, recognized that Little's boastful nature and failing health created a unique opportunity to solve dozens of unsolved murders. The interview process began in 2018 when Palazzolo and her team traveled to California to speak with Little about possible connections to unsolved cases. What they discovered was a killer who possessed an almost photographic memory for his crimes, able to recall specific details about murders that had occurred decades earlier. He remembered everything, Palazzolo said in a later interview. The victims' appearances, what they were wearing, where he picked them up, how he killed them, where he disposed of their bodies, but he couldn't remember what he had for breakfast that morning. The FBI's approach to the Little interviews was methodical and strategic. Rather than confronting him with accusations, they allowed him to control the narrative, encouraging him to share his memories in his own words. This approach proved remarkably effective, as Little seemed to enjoy the attention and the opportunity to relive his crimes. Over the course of 700 hours of recorded interviews, Little confessed to 93 murders spanning 19 states. His confessions were remarkably detailed, including specific information about crime scenes, victim characteristics, and disposal methods that only the killer could have known. To assist with victim identification, Little created dozens of sketches, drawing from memory the faces of women he had killed decades earlier. The sketches themselves became a crucial investigative tool. Little possessed genuine artistic ability, and his drawings were often detailed enough to assist with victim identification. The FBI released many of these sketches to the public, leading to tips and identifications that helped solve cold cases across the country. One of the most disturbing aspects of Little's confessions was his detailed recollection of his victims' final moments. He described to investigators how he would study their faces as they died, memorizing their expressions of terror and pain. This psychological component of his crimes revealed a level of sadism that went beyond simple murder. Little derived sexual pleasure from the process of killing itself. The victims Little described to investigators represented a cross-section of America's most vulnerable populations. Many were women of color, reflecting both Little's racial targeting and the broader systemic inequalities that made these women particularly vulnerable to predation. Others were struggling with addiction, mental illness, or poverty, circumstances that often isolated them from support systems that might have protected them. Martha Cunningham was a 35-year-old black woman from Kokomo, Indiana, who became one of Little's victims in 1975. Cunningham had been working as a sex worker to support her drug addiction when she encountered Little at a local bar. Her disappearance was reported by her sister, but police initially treated it as a case of someone who had simply moved on to another city. Her body was never found, and her case remained unsolved until Little's confession in 2018. The case of Cunningham and dozens of other victims highlighted the investigative failures that allowed Little to continue killing for decades. Police departments often failed to conduct thorough investigations into the disappearances of marginalized women, assuming they had simply moved on or died from drug-related causes. This lack of investigative rigor created an environment where serial killers like Little could operate with impunity. Dr. Scott Bonn, a criminologist who studied Little's case, argued that the failures went beyond individual police departments to reflect broader societal attitudes about victim worthiness. The criminal justice system has historically placed less value on the lives of marginalized victims, Bonn observed. This created a perfect hunting ground for predators like Little, who understood that certain types of victims could be killed with minimal risk of serious investigation. The geographic scope of Little's crimes was staggering. He killed in major metropolitan areas like Los Angeles, New York, and Miami, but also in smaller cities like Pascagoula, Mississippi, and Phoenix, Arizona. This mobility was both his strength and, ultimately, his weakness. While it allowed him to avoid detection for decades, it also meant that his crimes fell under the jurisdiction of dozens of different law enforcement agencies with varying levels of resources and expertise. The FBI's coordination of the Little investigation represented one of the most comprehensive multi-jurisdictional serial killer investigations in American history. Agents worked with police departments across 19 states, sharing information and coordinating efforts to verify Little's confessions and identify his victims. This collaborative approach was crucial to understanding the full scope of his crimes. One of the most significant challenges investigators faced was the passage of time. Many of Little's crimes had occurred decades earlier, and physical evidence had often been lost or destroyed. Witnesses had died or moved away, and case files had sometimes been misplaced or inadequately maintained. The FBI team had to rely heavily on Little's own confessions and their ability to corroborate his statements through existing records. The process of verification was painstaking and often frustrating. Little's confessions were generally accurate about major details, but he sometimes confused dates, locations, or victim characteristics. Investigators had to carefully cross-reference his statements with missing person reports, autopsy records, and other documentation to confirm which confessions were credible. In many cases, Little's confessions provided closure for families who had spent decades wondering what had happened to their loved ones. Rosetta Hines had been searching for answers about her sister's disappearance for over 40 years when the FBI contacted her in 2019. Her sister, Fredonia Smith, had vanished from Haines City, Florida, in 1975, and despite repeated inquiries to police, the family had never received satisfactory answers about what had happened. When the FBI agent called and told me they had found my sister's killer, I cried for hours, Haines said in an interview. Not because I was happy, nothing could bring her back, but because finally, after all these years, I knew the truth. The emotional impact of Little's confessions extended beyond individual families to entire communities that had been affected by his crimes. In cities like Cincinnati, Cleveland, and Phoenix, local law enforcement agencies had to confront the reality that a serial killer had been operating in their jurisdictions for years without detection. This recognition led to policy changes and improved training for investigating cases involving marginalized victims. The psychological evaluation of Little revealed a complex personality structure that combined elements of antisocial personality disorder, sexual sadism, and racial prejudice. Dr. Reed Malloy, a forensic psychologist who reviewed Little's case, noted that his ability to compartmentalize his crimes was extraordinary. He could commit a brutal murder and then go about his daily life as if nothing had happened, Malloy observed. This level of psychological dissociation is what allowed him to continue killing for so long. Little's confessions also revealed the extent to which he had internalized societal prejudices about his victims. He frequently referred to them in derogatory terms and expressed no remorse for their deaths. This lack of empathy was particularly evident in his descriptions of victims who were black, reflecting the deep-seated racism that had shaped his worldview throughout his life. The media coverage of Little's case raised important questions about how society values different types of victims. While his crimes received significant attention after his confessions, many observers noted that this attention came only after he had been safely imprisoned. During his active killing years, the deaths of his victims had received minimal media coverage, reflecting broader patterns of how crimes against marginalized people are reported and investigated. Little's health began to decline rapidly during his incarceration. Diabetes, heart problems, and other chronic conditions took their toll, and by 2019, he was confined to a wheelchair and required constant medical care. Despite his physical deterioration, his memory of his crimes remained remarkably clear, and he continued to provide investigators with new information about unsolved cases. The FBI's work with Little continued until shortly before his death. In his final interviews, he provided additional details about several cases and created new sketches of victims whose identities remained unknown. His cooperation with investigators was motivated not by remorse, but by a desire for attention and a sense of pride in his crimes. Samuel Little died on December 30th, 2020, at the age of 80 in a hospital outside Los Angeles. His death marked the end of one of the most extensive serial killer investigations in American history, but it also left many questions unanswered. Despite his numerous confessions, investigators believe there may be additional victims whose cases were never connected to Little. The legacy of Samuel Little's crimes extends far beyond the individual tragedies of his victims. His case exposed systemic failures in how law enforcement agencies investigate crimes against marginalized people and highlighted the need for better coordination between jurisdictions in serial killer investigations. The FBI's work on the Little case has become a model for how to approach complex, multi-jurisdictional investigations involving prolific offenders. Perhaps most importantly, Little's case has forced American society to confront uncomfortable truths about whose lives are valued and whose deaths are thoroughly investigated. The fact that he was able to kill for over 3 decades without detection reflects not just investigative failures, but broader societal attitudes that devalued the lives of his victims. The families of Little's victims continue to seek justice and closure. Many have filed civil lawsuits against police departments and other agencies, arguing that investigative failures allowed Little to continue killing. While these legal proceedings cannot bring back their loved ones, they serve as important reminders of the human cost of systemic failures in the criminal justice system. Today, the investigation into Samuel Little's crimes continues. Cold case investigators across the country continue to review unsolved murders that might be connected to his decades-long killing spree. The FBI maintains a database of his confessions and sketches, and they continue to receive tips from the public about possible connections to unsolved cases. The story of Samuel Little serves as a stark reminder of the consequences when society fails to protect its most vulnerable members. His victims, women struggling with addiction, poverty, and other challenges, deserved the same level of protection and investigative attention as any other citizens. Their deaths should not have been dismissed or ignored simply because of their circumstances. As investigators continue to work through the massive amount of information Little provided, one thing remains clear. The true measure of a society's justice system is not how it treats the wealthy and powerful, but how it protects and seeks justice for the most vulnerable. In this measure, American society failed Samuel Little's victims for decades, allowing a monster to prey upon them with impunity while they lived in the shadows of society's indifference. The Diary Killer, Juan Valdivia's written confessions. The morning mist clung to the cobblestone streets of Mexico City like a shroud, its tendrils curling around the legs of early risers who hurried past the shadowed doorways of the capital's oldest neighborhoods. It was March 15th, 1950, and Detective Inspector Ramon Cervantes had no idea that the leather-bound journal tucked beneath his arm would soon reveal one of the most methodical and disturbing killing sprees in Mexican criminal history. The diary, recovered from a ramshackle apartment in the Doctores district just hours earlier, contained the meticulous handwritten confessions of Juan Valdivia, a man whose 8-year reign of terror had claimed the lives of 26 women across Mexico's heartland. Cervantes paused at the entrance to the Procuraduría General de Justicia, the federal prosecutor's office, and felt the weight of the journal against his ribs. Inside its yellowed pages lay the detailed accounts of murders spanning from 1942 to 1950, written in the careful script of a man who treated killing with the same methodical precision others might reserve for keeping household accounts. Each entry was dated, each victim described with chilling specificity, each method of murder documented as if Valdivia were cataloguing specimens in a macabre collection. The story of Juan Valdivia begins not with violence, but with the grinding poverty that defined Mexico in the 1920s. Born in 1918 in the rural village of Teotihuacan, 30 miles northeast of Mexico City, Valdivia entered a world still reeling from the Mexican Revolution's aftermath. His father, Miguel Valdivia, was a seasonal laborer who worked the agave fields when drought didn't claim the crops, and his mother, Carmen Herrera, took in washing from the few families wealthy enough to afford such luxuries. Their adobe house, shared with Juan's 4 siblings, sat at the edge of the village, where the ancient pyramids cast long shadows across fields that had fed civilizations for millennia. But there was something different about Juan from the beginning. While his brothers and sisters played in the dusty streets or helped with family chores, Juan preferred solitude. He would disappear for hours, returning with small animals he claimed to have found dead. Rabbits, birds, the occasional stray cat. His mother noticed how carefully he would arrange these creatures, how he would sit and stare at them, with an intensity that made her cross herself and whisper prayers to the Virgin of Guadalupe. School records from the local parish, discovered decades later by researchers studying the case, show that Juan was an exceptional student despite the family's poverty. Father Miguel Sanchez, who taught at the village school from 1925 to 1935, noted in his personal diary that young Juan possessed an unsettling intelligence and displayed remarkable attention to detail in his writing exercises. The priest also recorded disturbing observations about the boy's behavior. Juan shows no emotion when discussing death or suffering. When asked to write about his family, he focuses exclusively on their physical appearances and daily routines, as if cataloguing strangers rather than describing loved ones. The first hint of Juan's future pathology emerged in 1934 when he was 16. Elena Morales, a 13-year-old girl from a neighboring farm, disappeared while walking to the market in Teotihuacan. Her body was discovered 3 days later in an abandoned well, bearing signs of sexual assault and manual strangulation. Local authorities, understaffed and undertrained, conducted a perfunctory investigation that yielded no arrests. What they didn't know was that Juan had begun keeping a journal that very year, a practice that would continue for the next 16 years and ultimately become his downfall. In 1935, Juan left Teotihuacan for Mexico City, joining the massive migration of rural poor seeking opportunities in the rapidly modernizing capital. President Lázaro Cárdenas had promised land redistribution and industrial jobs, but for most migrants like Juan, the city offered only overcrowded tenements and backbreaking labor. He found work in a textile factory in the Doctores neighborhood, operating looms in conditions that would be considered criminal by today's standards. The factory records, preserved in the Mexico City Municipal Archives, show that Juan Valdivia worked night shifts from 1935 to 1940, earning barely enough to rent a corner bed in a boarding house he shared with a dozen other men. But the city also provided Juan with something his rural village could not: anonymity and access to vulnerable women. Mexico City in the 1930s was a place of stark contrasts, where gleaming Art Deco buildings rose beside sprawling slums, where modern streetcars carried passengers past indigenous women selling corn from blankets spread on ancient stones. For predators like Juan, the city's chaos and indifference created perfect hunting grounds. The first murder, documented in Juan's diary, took place on July 4, 1942. His target was Maria Guadalupe Herrera, a 19-year-old domestic worker who cleaned houses in the upscale Colonia Roma district. Juan's entry for that date, written in his characteristically neat handwriting, reads, MGH, age 19, height approximately 1.55 meters, weight 48 kilos, black hair worn in braids, small scar on left hand from childhood accident. Followed her from the tram stop on Avenida Insurgentes. She walked quickly, but without awareness of her surroundings. I approached her near the fountain in Plaza Rio de Janeiro, asking for directions to the post office. She was kind, trusting. This kindness was her weakness. The diary entry continues with disturbing clinical detail about how Juan lured Maria to a construction site, sexually assaulted her, and then strangled her with his bare hands. But what makes the entry particularly chilling is not just the description of the crime, but Juan's meticulous observation of his victim's final moments. Her eyes showed confusion first, then fear, then acceptance. The transition from life to death took approximately 3 minutes and 45 seconds. I counted. He concluded the entry by noting the location where he disposed of her body, a detail that would later help investigators identify several previously unknown victims. Maria Guadalupe Herrera's disappearance was reported to police by her employer, Señora Dolores Vázquez, who described her as reliable and devoted to her job. The investigation, such as it was, lasted less than a week. Detective reports from the Mexico City Police Archives show that authorities questioned a few neighbors and checked local hospitals, but with no body and no witnesses, the case was quickly relegated to the growing pile of unsolved disappearances that plagued the capital. This pattern would repeat itself 25 more times over the next 8 years. Juan's diary reveals a systematic approach to selecting victims that demonstrated both patience and predatory intelligence. He preferred young women between the ages of 16 and 25, typically those who worked as domestic servants, factory workers, or street vendors, women whose disappearances were less likely to generate intensive police investigations. His hunting grounds were the transitional neighborhoods where the city's working poor lived: Doctores, Obrera, Alamos, and parts of the historic center where colonial mansions had been subdivided into crowded tenements. The diary entries show Juan's evolution from opportunistic killer to methodical predator. By 1943, he had developed what he called his sistema, a system for stalking potential victims. He would spend weeks observing women's routines, noting their schedules, their routes to and from work, their social connections. He paid particular attention to those who seemed isolated or vulnerable. In an entry dated September 12, 1943, he wrote, "Observed subject for 12 days. Lives alone in room on Calle Regina. No regular visitors. Works at cigarette factory on Calle Lopez. Takes same route home each evening, stopping at church on Wednesdays. Appears to have no close friends among other workers. Ideal candidate." The subject was Carmen Elena Vidal, a 22-year-old woman from Michoacán who had come to Mexico City to escape an abusive father. Her body was found 2 weeks later in a drainage canal in Xochimilco, but by then, Juan had already selected his next victim and was deep into his surveillance routine. What emerges from Juan's diary is a portrait of a killer who derived as much satisfaction from the stalking and planning as from the murders themselves. His entries reveal a man who saw his victims not as human beings, but as problems to be solved, challenges to be overcome through careful observation and methodical execution. He recorded details about their appearances, their habits, their fears, and their hopes, with the same dispassionate precision a scientist might use to document laboratory specimens. The diary also provides insight into Juan's psychological state during these years. Unlike many serial killers who report feeling driven by uncontrollable urges, Juan's writings suggest a man in complete control of his actions. He planned each murder weeks in advance, considered various approaches, and even abandoned some potential victims if circumstances weren't favorable. In one entry from 1944, he wrote, "Initially selected RMF, but discovered she has boyfriend who walks her home from work. Too risky. Will continue surveillance until opportunity improves or will select new candidate." This level of self-control and planning made Juan particularly dangerous, but it also meant that his crimes didn't fit the pattern that investigators of the era were trained to recognize. Police in 1940s Mexico City were accustomed to crimes of passion, domestic violence, and robbery-related murders. The concept of a serial killer who methodically hunted strangers was largely unknown in Mexican law enforcement circles. As a result, Juan's murders were investigated as isolated incidents, if they were investigated at all. The social context of 1940s Mexico also worked in Juan's favor. The country was undergoing massive social and economic changes under President Manuel Ávila Camacho, who had succeeded Cárdenas in 1940. Mexico's entry into World War II on the side of the Allies had brought industrial growth and urbanization, but it had also created social instability and stretched law enforcement resources thin. Young women disappearing from Mexico City's working-class neighborhoods was seen as an unfortunate but inevitable consequence of urban growth, not as evidence of a systematic predator. Juan's diary entries from 1945 and 1946 show him becoming increasingly confident and sadistic. Where his early murders had been relatively quick strangulations, he began to prolong his victims' suffering, conducting what he called experiments to observe their reactions to different types of physical and psychological torture. An entry from March 1946 describes in graphic detail how he kept one victim, identified only as LP, alive for several hours while he tested her responses to various stimuli. The clinical language he used to describe these tortures reads like a perverted scientific journal, showing how completely Juan had dehumanized his victims. The diary also reveals that Juan was aware of police investigations into some of the disappearances and took active steps to avoid detection. He moved frequently between different boarding houses and rented rooms, never staying in one place for more than a few months. He varied his methods of approaching victims and disposal of bodies. Most cunningly, he sometimes traveled to other cities to commit murders, understanding that this would make it even more difficult for authorities to connect the crimes. In 1947, Juan's activities briefly came to the attention of Detective Inspector Cervantes, the same man who would eventually discover his diary 3 years later. Cervantes had been assigned to investigate the disappearance of Rosa Maria Gutierrez, a 17-year-old street vendor who sold flowers near the cathedral in the historic center. Rosa Maria's mother, Esperanza Gutierrez, had insisted that her daughter would never run away and demanded a thorough investigation. Cervantes was unusual among Mexico City police officers of the era. Born in 1910 to a middle-class family, he had attended the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico for 2 years before joining the police force in 1932. He had a methodical approach to investigations and was one of the few officers who maintained detailed case files. His investigation into Rosa Maria's disappearance was more thorough than most, involving interviews with dozens of people and a systematic search of the areas where she was known to work and live. What Cervantes discovered was disturbing. Over the previous year, at least 4 young women who worked as street vendors in the historic center had disappeared under similar circumstances. All were between 16 and 20 years old. All lived alone or with minimal family support, and all had vanished without a trace. Cervantes began to suspect that the disappearances were connected, but his superiors dismissed his concerns. Captain Aurelio Mendoza, head of the detective division, told Cervantes that young women from poor families often disappeared for various reasons: pregnancy, shame, better opportunities elsewhere, and that investigating every missing person case as a potential murder would overwhelm the department's limited resources. Frustrated but undeterred, Cervantes continued his investigation on his own time. He created a chart mapping the locations where the women had last been seen, and noticed that all the disappearances had occurred within a few blocks of each other. He also identified several witnesses who reported seeing the missing women talking to a well-dressed man in his 20s or 30s shortly before they vanished. The descriptions were vague and sometimes contradictory, but they suggested a pattern that Cervantes found deeply troubling. Juan's diary from this period shows that he was aware of increased police attention, but wasn't particularly concerned. In an entry dated August 15, 1947, he wrote, "Detective asking questions about missing girls. Showed my photograph to several vendors. Description I gave witnesses was intentionally inaccurate. Claimed to be traveling salesman from Guadalajara, wore different clothes, spoke with affected accent. Police investigation lacks coordination and scientific method. I'm confident in my security." Juan's confidence proved justified. Without the resources or institutional support to conduct a proper investigation, Cervantes was forced to abandon his inquiry when he was reassigned to other cases. Rosa Maria Gutierrez joined the growing list of unsolved disappearances, and Juan continued his killing spree with renewed confidence. The years 1948 and 1949 marked the peak of Juan's criminal activity. His diary from this period shows him killing with increasing frequency, sometimes as often as once a month. His victims during this period included Teresa Morales, a 20-year-old seamstress, Patricia Hernandez, an 18-year-old who worked in a bakery, Magdalena Ruiz, a 24-year-old widow with 2 young children, and Ana Garcia, a 19-year-old who had recently arrived from rural Oaxaca seeking work. Each murder was meticulously planned and executed with the same cold precision that had characterized Juan's earlier crimes. But the diary entries from this period also reveal subtle changes in his psychological state. His writing became more grandiose, with references to his mission and his role as an instrument of natural selection. He began to see himself as superior to both his victims and the police, who failed to catch him, writing in one entry, "I have become invisible to them, a ghost who moves through their world, taking what I choose. They are insects, unable to comprehend the predator among them." This growing sense of superiority would ultimately contribute to Juan's downfall. In late 1949, he made his first significant mistake. He began to revisit the locations where he had disposed of previous victims. His diary entries suggest this was partly nostalgic and partly practical, as he wanted to ensure that the bodies remained hidden. But these return visits increased his exposure and provided opportunities for witnesses to see him in areas where he had no legitimate reason to be. The beginning of the end came on February 14th, 1950, Valentine's Day. Juan had selected his next victim, a 21-year-old woman named Esperanza Cruz, who worked as a cleaner in a government office building. Following his usual pattern, he had been stalking her for weeks, learning her routines and identifying the best location for an approach. But when he attempted to lure her to an isolated area near the Templo de San Hipólito, Esperanza became suspicious and began to scream. Her screams attracted the attention of Father Antonio Morales, a priest who was walking to evening mass at the temple. Father Morales, a former boxer who had found religion after a near-fatal fight in 1935, didn't hesitate to intervene. He chased Juan for several blocks before losing him in the maze of streets around the Alameda Central. But during the chase, Father Morales got a good look at Juan's face and was able to provide police with the most detailed description they had received of the suspect. Detective Inspector Cervantes, who had been promoted to head of the Missing Persons Unit, immediately recognized the potential significance of the Valentine's Day incident. The attempted abduction had occurred in the same general area where several women had disappeared over the previous years, and the description provided by Father Morales matched witness accounts from earlier cases. For the first time, Cervantes had a specific suspect and recent photographic evidence. Father Morales had been carrying a camera and had managed to take a distant photograph of Juan during the chase. The photograph, though grainy and partially obscured, was circulated to police stations throughout Mexico City. Within a week, officers had identified Juan as a man who had been questioned in connection with several minor crimes over the years and who was known to frequent the neighborhoods where the disappearances had occurred. More importantly, they had traced him to his current residence, a small room in a boarding house on Calle Dr. La Vista in the Doctores neighborhood. The raid on Juan's room took place at dawn on March 15th, 1950. Cervantes led a team of 6 officers, expecting to find evidence of the crimes, but not knowing the full extent of what they would discover. Juan was not in his room when they arrived. He had left before sunrise for his job at a different textile factory where he had been working since 1948. But what the officers found in his absence was extraordinary. 13 handwritten journals dating back to 1934, containing detailed accounts of 26 murders committed between 1942 and 1950. Cervantes spent hours in Juan's room, reading through the journals with growing horror and fascination. Here was not just evidence of multiple murders, but a comprehensive record of a serial killer's methodology, psychology, and evolution over nearly a decade. The journals contained details that could only have been known by the killer, specific locations where bodies had been disposed of, personal items taken from victims, and precise descriptions of how each murder had been committed. But perhaps most shocking was the realization that Juan had been documenting his crimes in real time, writing entries immediately after each murder while the details were still fresh in his memory. This wasn't the boastful confession of a killer seeking attention, but the methodical record-keeping of a man who approached murder with the same systematic precision others might bring to a business enterprise. Juan returned to his boarding house that evening, unaware that police had discovered his journals. He was arrested without incident as he climbed the stairs to his room, showing no surprise or emotion when Detective Cervantes identified himself and placed him under arrest. His only comment was to ask if the officers had been careful with his personal papers. The interrogation of Juan Valdivia began immediately and continued for 3 days. Unlike many criminals who deny their crimes or offer elaborate justifications, Juan readily admitted to the murders documented in his journals. He showed no remorse for his victims, but expressed frustration that police had found his records before he had completed what he called his project. When asked what this project entailed, Juan replied that he had planned to kill 50 women before retiring from what he termed his research. The details Juan provided during his interrogation allowed police to recover the remains of several previously unknown victims. His precise descriptions of disposal sites led to the discovery of skeletal remains in locations throughout Mexico City and its surroundings. In total, investigators were able to confirm 26 murders, though they suspected Juan may have been responsible for additional deaths that couldn't be definitively proven. The trial of Juan Valdivia began on September 15, 1950, in Mexico City's criminal court. The case attracted enormous public attention, both because of the number of victims and because of the methodical nature of the crimes. Mexican newspapers had never covered a case quite like this one, and the concept of a serial killer was so foreign to public understanding that journalists struggled to explain Juan's motivations and methods. The prosecution, led by Attorney General Carlos Hernandez, faced the challenge of presenting evidence from 26 separate murders in a legal system that was not equipped to handle such complex cases. The trial lasted 3 months, with prosecutors methodically presenting evidence from each murder, using Juan's own diary entries as primary evidence of his guilt. Juan's defense attorney, court-appointed lawyer Miguel Ángel Cortés, attempted to argue that his client was mentally ill and therefore not responsible for his actions. But this strategy was undermined by the detailed, rational nature of Juan's diary entries, which showed careful planning and clear understanding of the consequences of his actions. Court-appointed psychiatrists who examined Juan concluded that while he showed signs of antisocial personality disorder, he was legally sane and fully understood the nature of his crimes. On December 18, 1950, Juan Valdivia was found guilty on 26 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Under Mexican law at the time, multiple murders could be punished by execution, though the death penalty was rarely carried out. Juan showed no emotion when the sentence was read, asking only if he would be allowed to continue writing in prison. Juan's execution was carried out by firing squad on March 15, 1951, exactly 1 year after the discovery of his journals. He declined to make a final statement, asking instead for paper and pen to write one final diary entry. Prison records show that his last written words were, "The experiment concludes. Results have been recorded for future reference. Method proved effective, but required greater operational security. Recommend improved surveillance techniques for future applications." The case of Juan Valdivia sent shockwaves through Mexican society and fundamentally changed how law enforcement approached missing person cases and serial crimes. Detective Inspector Cervantes, whose persistence had ultimately led to Juan's capture, was promoted to head of a new criminal investigation unit specifically designed to identify patterns in violent crimes. The unit, established in 1951, was among the first in Latin America to employ what would later be known as criminal profiling techniques. The discovery of Juan's journals also led to significant changes in how missing person cases were investigated. Police departments throughout Mexico began maintaining centralized records of disappearances and looking for patterns that might indicate serial criminal activity. These procedural changes, directly inspired by the Valdivia case, helped prevent similar killing sprees in subsequent decades. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Juan Valdivia case was its demonstration of the importance of systematic record-keeping in criminal investigations. Juan's own meticulous documentation of his crimes had provided the evidence needed to convict him, but it also revealed how many murders had gone undetected and uninvestigated. The case highlighted the need for better communication between police departments and more sophisticated analytical techniques to identify patterns in criminal behavior. The families of Juan's victims received little closure from his conviction and execution. Most of the remains recovered were so decomposed that positive identification was impossible, and many families never learned the fate of their missing daughters, sisters, and wives. But the case did bring attention to the vulnerability of working-class women in Mexico City and led to some improvements in police response to missing person reports involving young women. Today, the Juan Valdivia case is studied in criminal justice programs throughout Latin America as an early example of serial killing and the importance of criminal profiling. His journals, preserved in the Mexico City Police Archives, remain a unique historical document, a first-person account of a serial killer's methodology and psychology written by the killer himself. They provide insights into criminal behavior that continue to inform psychological and criminological research more than 70 years after they were written. The story of Juan Valdivia serves as a grim reminder of how societal indifference to the disappearances of marginalized people can enable predators to operate with impunity. His victims were young women whose deaths were initially dismissed as unfortunate but inevitable consequences of urban poverty. It was only when Juan's own compulsive record-keeping provided undeniable evidence of systematic murder that authorities were forced to confront the reality of what had been happening in their city for nearly a decade. In the end, Juan Valdivia's legacy is not just one of evil, but of institutional failure and eventual reform. His crimes exposed the weaknesses in Mexico's criminal justice system, but they also led to improvements that helped protect future potential victims. The methodical killer who documented his own crimes with such precision ultimately became the catalyst for more methodical and precise criminal investigations that continue to this day. The ABC Killer, Moses Sithole and South Africa's Trail of Broken Dreams. The morning mist clung to the grasslands outside Atteridgeville like a shroud, carrying with it the acrid smell of burning refuse from the nearby townships. It was October 18th, 1995, and the body of 22-year-old Tryphena Magotsi lay twisted among the wild grass, her own underwear wrapped tightly around her neck. Her dreams of employment now nothing more than another statistic in post-apartheid South Africa's growing catalogue of violence against women. Detective Mickey Pistorius would later describe this moment as the one that changed everything, not just for the investigation that would consume the next year of her life, but for the entire understanding of serial killing in a country still bleeding from decades of institutionalized oppression. As she crouched beside Tryphena's body that Wednesday morning, studying the ligature marks that had become horrifyingly familiar, Pistorius couldn't have known she was staring at the work of a man who would ultimately confess to 38 murders, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. Moses Sithole had already been active for more than a year by the time Tryphena's body was discovered. Born on November 17th, 1964, in the sprawling township of Kwathema, east of Johannesburg, Sithole's early life was a masterclass in the systematic dehumanization that apartheid South Africa inflicted upon its black citizens. His father abandoned the family when Moses was 5, leaving his mother, Sophie, to raise 7 children alone in a 2-room shack with no electricity or running water. The family survived on government handouts and whatever work Sophie could find as a domestic servant in the white suburbs, work that required her to leave before dawn and return after dark, leaving her children to fend for themselves in one of the country's most violent townships. The apartheid education system, designed to prepare black children for lives of servitude, offered Moses little hope of advancement. Bantu education, as it was euphemistically called, deliberately provided inferior schooling to black students. The native must be taught to realize that equality with Europeans is not for him. Minister of Native Affairs Hendrik Verwoerd had declared in 1953, 11 years before Moses's birth. By the time Moses reached adolescence in the late 1970s, this philosophy had created a generation of young black men with limited prospects and deep-seated rage against a system that had systematically excluded them from opportunity. The first glimpse of Moses's capacity for violence emerged in 1987, when he was 23 years old. On a sweltering January afternoon in Boksburg, Moses approached a young woman near the train station, claiming to represent an employment agency that could help her find domestic work. The woman, desperate for income like so many black South Africans navigating the country's discriminatory job market, agreed to accompany him to what he described as an interview location. Instead, Moses led her to an isolated area where he raped her at knife point. The attack was savage and methodical, lasting several hours. When it was over, Moses calmly informed his victim that she should consider herself lucky to be alive. The woman survived to testify against Moses, leading to his arrest and conviction for rape. The Boksburg Regional Court sentenced him to 7 years in prison, a sentence that, in retrospect, represents one of the most catastrophic failures of the South African justice system. Had Moses served his full term, 38 people might still be alive today. Instead, he was released after serving just 4 years, walking free in 1991 into a country convulsing with political transformation. Nelson Mandela's release from prison in February 1990 had triggered a period of unprecedented upheaval in South Africa. The apartheid system was crumbling, but the transition to democracy was chaotic and violent. Between 1990 and 1994, more than 14,000 people died in political violence as different factions struggled for power. The police force, trained for decades to suppress rather than serve black communities, found itself overwhelmed and underprepared for conventional law enforcement. Crime rates soared as the old order collapsed and the new one struggled to establish legitimacy. It was into this maelstrom that Moses Sithole emerged in 1994, armed with a sophisticated understanding of his victims' vulnerabilities and a pathological hatred of women that his prison experience had only intensified. His method was diabolically simple. He would approach young black women at train stations, taxi ranks, and other public spaces, identifying himself as David Salepe and claiming to represent Miracle Employment Agency, a fictitious company that specialized in placing domestic workers with white families in affluent neighborhoods. The pitch was irresistible to women struggling in South Africa's discriminatory economy. Even after apartheid's legal dismantling, black women faced unemployment rates exceeding 40%. Domestic work, while poorly paid and often exploitative, represented one of the few reliable sources of income available to black women without formal education. Moses understood this desperation intimately, having watched his own mother navigate similar circumstances throughout his childhood. His first confirmed victim was Margaret Mazibuko, a 34-year-old mother of 3 from Germiston. On July 16, 1994, Margaret met Moses at the Germiston train station after he had approached her sister 2 days earlier, promising lucrative domestic work in the northern suburbs. Margaret's family would later tell investigators that she had been excited about the prospect of steady employment, something that had eluded her for months. She dressed carefully that Saturday morning, wearing her best blouse and skirt, carrying a small bag with references from previous employers. Moses led Margaret to a secluded area near the old mine dumps outside Boksburg, claiming they were taking a shortcut to meet her prospective employer. Once they were alone, he raped and strangled her with her own underwear, leaving her body in the tall grass where it would remain undiscovered for 3 weeks. The decomposition was extensive by the time mine workers found her remains, making forensic analysis difficult, but not impossible. The ligature marks on her neck told a clear story of prolonged strangulation, and trace evidence suggested she had fought desperately for her life. The discovery of Margaret's body initially generated little attention from either the media or law enforcement. A black woman found dead in a township was hardly unusual in 1994, when South Africa was recording murder rates among the highest in the world. The Germiston police opened a file but assigned few resources to the investigation. The detective originally assigned to the case, Sergeant Johannes van der Merwe, would later admit that he considered it just another dead black woman and devoted minimal effort to finding her killer. This institutional indifference would prove catastrophic, as Moses's killing spree accelerated throughout the summer and fall of 1994. His victims followed a consistent pattern: young black women between the ages of 18 and 30, most unemployed and desperate for work, all lured with promises of domestic employment. He killed Monica Vilakazi on August 3rd, Agnes Sibaya on August 19th, Beauty Ndaba on September 2nd, and Josephine Mansali on September 14th. Each murder followed the same methodical script: the approach at a transport hub, the fictional job offer, the journey to an isolated location, the sexual assault, and finally, the ligature strangulation using the victim's own underwear. The underwear detail was particularly significant to Moses. During his later confessions, he would explain that using his victim's underwear as a murder weapon was both practical and symbolic. Practically, it left no trace evidence linking him to the crime scenes. Symbolically, it represented his desire to humiliate and degrade his victims, even in death. The choice revealed the deeply misogynistic worldview that drove his crimes, a perspective shaped by his traumatic childhood, his prison experience, and his internalization of the apartheid system's devaluation of black women's lives. By October 1994, Moses had developed a sophisticated routine that minimized his risk of detection while maximizing his access to potential victims. He had identified the most effective locations for encountering vulnerable women, primarily the Germiston, Boksburg, and Cleveland train stations, where hundreds of job seekers gathered daily hoping for employment opportunities. He had crafted a compelling cover story, complete with business cards for Miracle Employment Agency and detailed knowledge of domestic work requirements that made his offers seem legitimate. Most importantly, he had learned to read his victims' desperation, targeting women whose circumstances made them more likely to trust a stranger offering hope. The breakthrough in recognizing Moses's crimes as the work of a serial killer came from an unlikely source. Dr. Mickey Pistorius, a 32-year-old criminal psychologist who had recently returned to South Africa after studying FBI profiling techniques at Quantico. Pistorius had been brought into the South African Police Service as part of a broader effort to modernize investigative techniques, but she faced significant resistance from veteran detectives who viewed psychological profiling as unnecessary foreign influence. The resistance was particularly pronounced when dealing with crimes against black women. The apartheid-era police force had been trained to view black lives as expendable, and this mindset persisted even after the political transition. When Pistorius first proposed that a serial killer was targeting black women in the East Rand, several senior officers dismissed her theory as academic nonsense. Detective Colonel Suka Brits, who oversaw investigations in the region, reportedly told colleagues that black women get killed all the time. It doesn't mean there's a serial killer. But Pistorius persisted, driven by her analysis of the crime scene evidence and victimology patterns. She had identified 7 murders between July and October 1994 that shared crucial similarities. All victims were young black women. All had been sexually assaulted. All had been strangled with their own underwear, and all had been found in remote locations around the East Rand. The geographic clustering was particularly significant, suggesting a killer who was familiar with the area but mobile enough to vary his dump sites. The first major breakthrough came on November 12, 1994, when the body of Esther Maynetier was discovered near Cleveland. Unlike previous victims, Esther's body was found relatively quickly, allowing forensic specialists to preserve crucial evidence. Semen samples were collected and sent to the police laboratory for DNA analysis, a technique that was still relatively new in South African criminal investigations. More importantly, a witness had seen Esther talking to a man matching Moses's description at the Cleveland taxi rank the day before her disappearance. The witness, taxi driver Solomon Mathembu, provided the first detailed description of the killer. He described a man in his late 20s, well-dressed in a suit and tie, carrying a briefcase and speaking confidently about employment opportunities. Mathembu had noticed the man because his appearance was unusual for the area. Most people in Cleveland dressed casually, and few carried briefcases. The witness's description was detailed enough to create a composite sketch, which investigators began circulating throughout the East Rand. As 1994 ended, Moses had killed at least 12 women, but his crimes had generated minimal public attention. The victims were predominantly from poor townships, their deaths meriting brief mentions in local newspapers before being forgotten. This media indifference reflected broader societal attitudes about violence against black women in post-apartheid South Africa. While the country celebrated its political liberation, deeply ingrained prejudices about whose lives mattered continued to shape public discourse and police priorities. The new year brought no respite from Moses's killing spree. If anything, his confidence had grown, leading him to take greater risks and expand his geographic range. In January 1995, he killed 3 women in different provinces: Nomsa Simelan in Gauteng, Beauty Sono in the Free State, and Francina Nomsa in the Eastern Cape. The interstate nature of these crimes complicated the investigation, as different police services operated with minimal coordination and information sharing. The expansion of Moses's hunting ground also revealed the sophisticated planning behind his crimes. He had studied transportation networks throughout the region, identifying locations where vulnerable women congregated and mapping escape routes that allowed him to disappear quickly after each murder. His choice of dump sites showed tactical awareness. All were remote enough to delay discovery, but accessible enough for him to reach without drawing attention. The breakthrough that would ultimately lead to Moses's capture began on March 4, 1995, with the disappearance of Amelia Rappadeel from the Germiston train station. Unlike previous victims, Amelia had told several people about her meeting with the employment agent, including her sister Joyce, who had provided detailed descriptions of the man Amelia was supposed to meet. When Amelia failed to return home that evening, Joyce immediately contacted the police and provided them with the information she had gathered. Detective Captain Dave Pienaar, who had recently taken over the East Rand serial killer investigation, recognized the significance of Joyce's information. For the first time, investigators had real-time intelligence about the killer's activities, rather than discovering his crimes weeks or months after the fact. Pienaar immediately authorized surveillance of the Germiston station and other locations where the killer had been active, hoping to intercept him before he could claim another victim. The surveillance operation revealed the extent of Moses's activities. Over the course of 2 weeks, undercover officers observed him approaching dozens of women at various transportation hubs, using the same employment agency pitch that had proven so effective. Many women rejected his offers, but enough showed interest to provide him with a steady stream of potential victims. The officers noted his professional appearance, his confident demeanor, and his ability to quickly identify the most vulnerable targets in any crowd. On March 18, 1995, surveillance officers watched Moses approach 26-year-old Patricia Mabot at the Cleveland taxi rank. Patricia, who had been unemployed for 8 months, was initially skeptical of Moses's offer. but gradually warmed to his pitch as he provided specific details about domestic work requirements and salary expectations. The officers followed as Moses led Patricia away from the taxi rank, maintaining visual contact as they walked toward a more secluded area. The arrest, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. As Moses led Patricia toward the location where he planned to assault and kill her, Detective Sergeant Michael Themba and his partner emerged from concealment with weapons drawn. Moses initially attempted to flee, but was quickly subdued and taken into custody. Patricia Mabote, unaware of how close she had come to becoming victim number 39, was safely escorted home after providing a detailed statement about her interaction with Moses. The man police arrested that March afternoon bore little resemblance to the popular image of a serial killer. Moses Sithole was articulate, well-dressed, and superficially charming. He stood 5 feet 8 inches tall with a medium build, spoke multiple languages fluently, and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of employment practices in domestic service. During his initial interrogation, he maintained his innocence with calm confidence, insisting that he was simply trying to help unemployed women find work. But as investigators delved deeper into Moses's background, a darker picture emerged. His prison records revealed a history of sexual violence dating back to his 1987 rape conviction. His parole officer noted that Moses had struggled to find steady employment after his release, cycling through a series of menial jobs that he claimed were beneath his abilities. Psychological evaluations conducted during his incarceration had identified signs of antisocial personality disorder and deep-seated misogynistic attitudes, but these warnings had been ignored when he was granted early release. The forensic evidence against Moses was overwhelming. DNA samples collected from multiple crime scenes matched his genetic profile with a certainty of 99.99%. Fiber analysis linked clothing fibers found on several victims to garments in Moses's possession. Most damning of all, several surviving witnesses positively identified him as the man who had approached them with employment offers in the weeks and months leading up to various murders. As news of Moses's arrest spread throughout South Africa's black townships, a complex mix of emotions emerged. Relief that the killer had been caught was tempered by anger that it had taken so long for authorities to take the crime seriously. Many community leaders pointed out that if the victims had been white women from affluent neighborhoods, the investigation would have received immediate priority and massive resources. The fact that Moses had been able to kill for nearly 2 years while operating in plain sight was seen as evidence of continued institutional indifference to black lives. The investigation that followed Moses's arrest revealed the true scope of his crimes. Working with Mickey Pistorius and a team of behavioral analysts, detectives painstakingly reconstructed Moses's activities over the previous 2 years. They identified 76 separate incidents where he had approached women with employment offers, resulting in 38 confirmed murders and numerous sexual assaults. The geographic scope of his crimes stretched across 4 provinces, making him one of the most wide-ranging serial killers in modern criminal history. Moses's confession, when it finally came, was chilling in its matter-of-fact delivery. Speaking to investigators over the course of several weeks, he provided detailed accounts of each murder, describing his victims' final moments with disturbing clinical precision. He explained his selection criteria, his killing methods, and his disposal techniques with the same calm professionalism he had once used to discuss employment opportunities with his victims. The psychological profile that emerged from these confessions painted a portrait of a man consumed by rage against women and society. Moses blamed his crimes on his traumatic childhood, his prison experience, and what he described as the humiliation of being unable to find decent employment after his release. He expressed particular resentment toward the women he had killed, claiming they had deceived him by being willing to meet strange men for employment opportunities. In his twisted logic, Their desperation was evidence of moral weakness that justified their deaths. The trial of Moses Sithole began on October 21, 1996, at the Pretoria High Court before Justice David Carlin. The proceedings attracted unprecedented media attention, both for the horrific nature of the crimes and for their broader implications about violence against women in post-apartheid South Africa. Prosecutor Eben Jordan faced the challenging task of presenting evidence from 38 separate murder cases, while maintaining focus on the systematic nature of Moses's crimes. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. Over the course of 6 weeks, Jordan presented DNA evidence, fiber analysis, witness testimony, and Moses's own confessions to build an unshakable case for conviction. The evidence revealed not just the facts of each individual murder, but the calculating intelligence behind Moses's killing spree. He had studied his victims' vulnerabilities, exploited their economic desperation, and killed them with the efficiency that spoke to careful planning and complete emotional detachment. The defense, led by advocate Jaap Cilliers, faced an impossible task. With Moses's confessions, DNA evidence, and multiple witness identifications, there was no disputing his guilt. Instead, Cilliers focused on mitigation, arguing that Moses's traumatic background and mental health issues should be considered as factors that might spare him the death penalty. The strategy required a delicate balance, acknowledging Moses's responsibility for his crimes while painting him as a product of South Africa's apartheid system. The testimony of surviving victims proved particularly powerful. Several women who had encountered Moses but escaped his clutches took the stand to describe their interactions with the man they had initially trusted as a potential employer. Their accounts revealed the predatory skill with which Moses had identified and exploited vulnerable women, using their hopes for a better future as weapons against them. Patricia Maboti, the woman whose rescue had led to Moses's arrest, provided particularly compelling testimony. She described how Moses's professional appearance and detailed knowledge of domestic work had convinced her that his employment offer was legitimate. He knew exactly what to say, she told the court. He spoke about salaries, working conditions, even holiday time. I thought I was finally going to find steady work. The realization of how close she had come to becoming victim number 39 was visible in her trembling voice as she testified. The impact statements from victims' families revealed the broader devastation Moses's crimes had inflicted on South Africa's black communities. Mothers spoke of daughters who had simply vanished while seeking honest work to support their families. Sisters described the agony of waiting for news that never came, of searching morgues and hospitals for loved ones who had been reduced to Jane Doe statistics. The cumulative weight of 38 such losses created a portrait of systematic terror that had traumatized entire townships. Justice Carlin's verdict, delivered on December 5, 1996, was unequivocal. Moses Sithole was found guilty on all charges: 38 counts of murder, 40 counts of rape, and 6 counts of robbery. In pronouncing sentence, Justice Carlin described the crimes as the most heinous and barbaric he had encountered in 30 years on the bench. He noted that Moses had shown no genuine remorse for his actions and continued to blame his victims for their own deaths. The sentence was equally uncompromising: death by hanging on each murder count, with additional lengthy prison terms for the rape and robbery convictions. Under South African law at the time, the death sentences would run concurrently, meaning Moses would face execution once all appeals were exhausted. However, this sentence would never be carried out. In 1995, the newly democratic South Africa had abolished capital punishment, and Moses's death sentences were automatically commuted to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The aftermath of Moses Sithole's conviction sparked broader conversations about violence against women in South Africa and the institutional failures that had allowed his crimes to continue for so long. Women's rights activists pointed to the case as evidence of systemic indifference to crimes against black women, noting that the investigation had gained momentum only when academic researchers and international experts became involved. Dr. Mickey Pistorius, whose profiling work had been crucial to understanding Moses's crimes, used the case to advocate for improved training in serial crime investigation. She argued that the South African Police Service needed to develop indigenous expertise in behavioral analysis rather than relying on foreign consultants. Her work on the Sithole case would establish her as one of the world's leading experts on serial crime, leading to her involvement in high-profile cases throughout Africa and beyond. The case also highlighted the intersection between South Africa's apartheid legacy and contemporary crime patterns. Moses's ability to operate undetected for nearly 2 years reflected not just investigative failures, but deeper societal attitudes about whose lives were worth protecting. The fact that his victims were predominantly poor, black, and female meant their deaths received minimal attention from media, police, and politicians, who might have demanded action if the victims had been white or wealthy. Moses Sithole remains incarcerated at Seamax Prison outside Pretoria, serving 2,410 years in prison for his crimes. Now, in his late 50s, he has shown no signs of remorse or rehabilitation during his 2 decades behind bars. Prison officials describe him as a model prisoner who maintains his innocence despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt. He has filed numerous appeals over the years, all of which have been rejected by South African courts. The legacy of Moses Sithole's crimes extends far beyond the immediate tragedy of 38 lives lost. His case forced South Africa to confront uncomfortable truths about how violence against women was investigated and prosecuted in the post-apartheid era. It revealed the extent to which colonial and apartheid attitudes about black women's lives continued to influence criminal justice priorities. Most importantly, it demonstrated the catastrophic consequences when institutional indifference meets predatory violence. The women Moses Sithole killed were more than just statistics in a criminal case file. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends whose dreams of honest employment were twisted into instruments of their own destruction. Margaret Mazibuko had been planning to use her domestic work earnings to send her children to better schools. Monica Vilakazi had hoped to save enough money to start a small business selling vegetables at the local market. Agnes Sibia had dreamed of earning enough to help her elderly mother repair their family home. These dreams, multiplied by 38, represent not just individual tragedies, but a broader indictment of a society that failed to protect its most vulnerable members. The fact that Moses could operate with impunity for nearly 2 years, approaching hundreds of women in broad daylight at public transportation hubs, reveals systemic failures that extended far beyond any single investigation. As South Africa continues to grapple with among the world's highest rates of violence against women, the Moses Sithole case serves as both a warning and a call to action. It demonstrates how economic desperation, institutional indifference, and societal prejudice can create hunting grounds for predators. It shows how the legacy of systematic oppression can manifest in criminal behavior that targets the most marginalized members of society. The case also illustrates the importance of taking crimes against vulnerable populations seriously from the outset. Had the first few murders been investigated with the same intensity that was eventually brought to bear on the case, dozens of lives might have been saved. The institutional learning that emerged from Moses's crimes has led to improved protocols for identifying and investigating serial crimes, but the human cost of that education was unconscionably high. Today, more than 25 years after his arrest, Moses Sithole's name remains synonymous with the targeting of vulnerable women seeking nothing more than honest work to survive. His crimes serve as a stark reminder that in societies marked by extreme inequality and historical injustice, those with the least protection are often the most targeted by predatory violence. The 38 women he killed died not just because of his individual pathology, but because of systemic failures that rendered their lives invisible until it was too late. Their memory deserves more than a place in crime statistics. It demands a commitment to creating societies where economic desperation cannot be weaponized against the vulnerable, where all victims receive equal attention and protection, and where the dream of honest employment does not become a pathway to victimization. Only then will the true legacy of Moses Sythol's crimes be measured not just in lives lost, but in the systemic changes necessary to prevent such tragedies from recurring. The highway predator, Ahmad Najib Aris, and Malaysia's Night of Terror. The humid air of Kuala Lumpur hung thick with monsoon promise on the evening of March 15, 2017, as the city's arteries pulsed with their familiar rhythm of traffic and life. Neon signs reflected off rain-slicked streets while taxi drivers navigated the labyrinthine roads of Malaysia's capital, their yellow vehicles weaving through the urban maze like illuminated fish in dark waters. Among them, a blue Proton Wira sedan prowled the night, its driver scanning the sidewalks with predatory intent that belied the innocent occupation painted across his windshield. Ahmad Najib Aris, 34 years old with the unremarkable features that would later allow him to blend seamlessly into witness descriptions, had been driving taxis in Kuala Lumpur for nearly 8 years. To his passengers, neighbours, and the occasional acquaintance at the local mamak stall, he appeared to be nothing more than another working-class Malaysian, trying to make ends meet in an increasingly expensive city. His vehicle registration indicated legitimate taxi operations, complete with the necessary permits and insurance documents that suggested a man operating within society's boundaries. But beneath this carefully maintained veneer of normalcy, Ahmad Najib harboured impulses that would soon transform him into one of Malaysia's most disturbing serial killers of the modern era. The psychological architecture of his mind had been constructed through years of isolation, rejection, and a growing resentment toward the world that he felt had denied him the recognition and power he deserved. His taxi became more than a means of earning a living. It evolved into a mobile hunting ground where he could exert absolute control over vulnerable individuals who willingly entered his domain. The first indication that something was catastrophically wrong came on March 18, 2017, when Puan Mariam Abdullah failed to return home to her family's modest apartment in Sheras. The 42-year-old seamstress had left work at her usual time, bidding farewell to colleagues at the textile factory where she had worked for over a decade. Security cameras captured her final moments of normal life as she waited at a bus stop along Jalan Sheras, her work bag slung over her shoulder and her phone pressed to her ear as she spoke with her teenage daughter about dinner plans. What those cameras couldn't capture was the moment when Ahmad Najib's blue Proton pulled alongside the bus stop, his window rolling down as he offered her a ride at a price too reasonable to refuse. Mariam's decision to accept, a choice made by countless urban workers every day to save money and time, would make her the first victim in a killing spree that would terrorize Kuala Lumpur for the next 6 weeks. The Royal Malaysia Police initially treated Mariam's disappearance as a routine missing person case. Inspector Razak Hamza, a 20-year veteran of the force who had handled hundreds of similar reports, filed the standard paperwork and initiated preliminary inquiries. Missing persons in a city of nearly 2 million were unfortunately common, often resolved within days as individuals returned from unannounced trips or family emergencies. The statistical reality suggested that Mariam would likely reappear with a reasonable explanation for her absence. But as days stretched into a week, then 2, the case began to develop an ominous weight that settled over the investigators like a shroud. Mariam's bank accounts showed no activity, her phone remained disconnected, and interviews with family and friends revealed no history of disappearing or any reason she might have voluntarily vanished. The seamstress had been planning her daughter's upcoming birthday celebration and had recently put down a deposit on a new apartment, hardly the actions of someone preparing to abandon her life. The discovery that would shatter any remaining optimism came on April 2, 2017, when a construction worker clearing vegetation from a drainage canal in Puchong made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Partially concealed beneath a tangle of water hyacinth and urban debris, human remains had been dumped with a casualness that spoke to their killer's complete dehumanization of his victim. The remains that forensic pathologist Dr. Siti Aisha Mohammed examined in the sterile environment of Hospital Kuala Lumpur's morgue told a story of violence so extreme that even experienced investigators struggled to process the evidence. Mariam's body had been subjected to what the official autopsy report would clinically describe as extensive ante-mortem mutilation, a medical term that could never adequately convey the horror of what Ahmad Najib had inflicted upon his victim. The forensic evidence painted a terrifying picture of prolonged torture. Deep lacerations across the victim's torso suggested the use of multiple cutting implements, while defensive wounds on her hands and arms indicated that Mariam had fought desperately for her life. Most disturbing were the systematic injuries that appeared designed not to kill quickly, but to maximize suffering. Dr. Mohammed's report noted evidence of ligature marks, suggesting the victim had been restrained during the attack, and the pattern of injuries indicated the assault had continued over several hours. What transformed this from a horrific isolated murder into something far more sinister was the discovery of trace evidence that didn't match the victim or the dump site. Fiber analysis revealed synthetic materials consistent with automotive upholstery, specifically the type used in Malaysian-manufactured vehicles. More crucially, DNA evidence collected from beneath Mariam's fingernails would later prove to be the key that unlocked the entire case. As investigators worked to process the crime scene, Ahmad Najib was already selecting his next victim. His success in disposing of Mariam's body had given him confidence in his methods, and the lack of immediate police response suggested he could operate with relative impunity. The psychological gratification he had derived from the killing had also intensified his compulsions, creating a feedback loop that would drive him to escalate both the frequency and brutality of his attacks. On April 8, 2017, 28-year-old construction worker Shahrul Anwar finished his shift at a building site in Ampang and began his journey home to his pregnant wife. The couple had been married for 3 years and were expecting their first child in 2 months. Shahrul's daily routine rarely varied. He would catch a bus from the construction site to the main road, then take a taxi for the final leg of his journey home. It was a pattern Ahmad Najib had observed and carefully noted during his nocturnal prowling of the city's transportation hubs. When Shahrul stepped into Ahmad Najib's taxi that evening, he was focused on getting home to help his wife with dinner preparations and to feel their unborn child kicking in her swollen belly. He had no way of knowing that the soft-spoken driver who quoted him a fair price was mentally rehearsing the violence he would soon unleash. The GPS tracker in Ahmad Najib's phone would later show that instead of taking Shahrul directly home, he had driven to an isolated area near an abandoned housing development in Kajang, where the partially completed structures provided perfect concealment for his activities. The attack on Shahrul followed the same horrific pattern that had characterized Mariam's murder, but with escalated brutality that suggested Ahmad Najib's psychological state was deteriorating rapidly. The autopsy would reveal that the victim had been subjected to even more extensive mutilation, with evidence suggesting the killer had spent considerably more time with this victim than the first. The psychological satisfaction Ahmad Najib derived from complete domination over another human being was becoming the central organizing principle of his existence. Shahrul's disappearance prompted immediate concern from his family, who knew his predictable habits made unexplained absence highly unusual. His wife, Farida, was particularly distressed given her advanced pregnancy and complete dependence on her husband's emotional and financial support. When he failed to return home by midnight, she contacted police and began calling every hospital in the Klang Valley, desperately hoping he had been injured in an accident rather than fallen victim to something worse. The discovery of Shahrul's remains 3 days later in a rubber plantation in Seremban confirmed the worst fears of investigators who had begun to see patterns in the evidence. The same methodical mutilation, the same careful disposal in a location chosen for maximum concealment, and most importantly, the same trace evidence that linked both crime scenes to a common perpetrator. The realization that they were dealing with an active serial killer sent shockwaves through the Royal Malaysia Police hierarchy and triggered the formation of a special task force dedicated to the case. Inspector General Khalid Abu Bakar held a press conference on April 15, 2017, that would forever change the public perception of safety in Kuala Lumpur. Standing before a room packed with local and international journalists, Khalid announced that police were investigating possible connections between multiple murders and warned the public to exercise extreme caution when using unlicensed taxi services. The carefully worded statement was designed to alert the public without causing panic, but its effect was immediate and profound. The announcement triggered a wave of fear that rippled through Malaysia's urban centres. Taxi drivers reported dramatic decreases in passengers, particularly during evening hours, while ride-sharing applications saw unprecedented surges in usage as people sought alternatives they perceived as safer. The psychological impact on potential victims was exactly what Ahmad Najib had been seeking. The knowledge that an entire city lived in fear of his next attack fed his grandiose delusions and encouraged further escalation. But the press conference also had an unintended consequence that would ultimately contribute to Ahmad Najib's downfall. The increased media attention and public awareness meant that his activities would be subject to greater scrutiny, making it more difficult for him to operate with the anonymity that had previously protected him. Every taxi driver in the city was now a potential suspect in the minds of nervous passengers, and this heightened vigilance would soon produce the observational evidence that investigators needed. On April 22, 2017, Ahmad Najib made the tactical error that would begin his unraveling when he attempted to abduct Siti Nurhaliza, a 19-year-old university student returning from evening classes at University Malaya. Unlike his previous victims, Siti had been following the safety guidelines issued by police and had arranged to share her taxi ride with a friend. When Ahmad Najib realized he wouldn't be able to isolate Siti without witnesses, he completed the journey to her dormitory as requested, but not before Siti's friend noticed his unusual behavior and recorded his license plate number as a precaution. The near miss with Siti represented a crucial turning point in the investigation, though its significance wouldn't become apparent for several more days. Ahmad Najib's frustrated attempt at abduction had left him psychologically unstable and increasingly reckless in his victim selection. The careful stalking and methodical planning that had characterized his earlier attacks gave way to impulsive hunting that would make him more visible to potential witnesses and more likely to make the critical mistakes that would expose him. 3 days later, on April 25, 2017, Ahmad Najib encountered Li Wei Ming, a 26-year-old accounting clerk who had worked late to complete month-end financial reports at his office in Petaling Jaya. Li's decision to take a taxi home rather than drive his own car, a choice motivated by fatigue and a desire to rest during the journey, placed him directly in Ahmad Najib's path during what would prove to be the killer's most frenzied and disorganized attack. The crime scene where Li's body was eventually discovered revealed a killer whose psychological state had degraded significantly since his first murder. The level of violence inflicted was so extreme that forensic pathologists required additional time to complete their examination, and the haphazard disposal of the remains suggested that Ahmad Najib was operating in an increasingly erratic mental state. Most significantly, the killer had left behind substantially more physical evidence than in previous attacks, including clear tire impressions in the soft earth near the dump site. The tire impressions would prove to be the forensic breakthrough that investigators had been desperately seeking. Analysis by tire experts determined that the impressions had been made by Continental Conti Comfort Contact CC6 tires, a specific model and size combination that significantly narrowed the pool of potential suspect vehicles. When cross-referenced with taxi registration databases and the physical evidence collected from previous crime scenes, the investigation began to focus on a manageable number of suspects. As investigators worked methodically through their suspect list, Ahmad Najib was already planning his next attack. The psychological compulsion that drove his killing had reached a level where he could no longer function normally between murders. His taxi driving had become secondary to his primary occupation as a predator, and colleagues at the taxi stand where he occasionally parked began to notice his increasingly erratic behavior and extended absences. On May 1, 2017, Ahmad Najib encountered Rohani Qasim, a 35-year-old nurse finishing her night shift at Hospital Kajang. Rohani's profession had made her acutely aware of the dangers facing women traveling alone at night, and she had developed safety protocols that included sharing her location with family members and maintaining contact throughout her journey home. These precautions, combined with her medical training in recognizing dangerous situations, should have protected her from becoming Ahmad Najib's final victim. But Ahmad Najib had also evolved his methods in response to increased public awareness of the danger. He had modified his approach to appear more professional and trustworthy, installing additional taxi identification materials in his vehicle and adopting a more deferential manner with potential victims. When he approached Rohani outside the hospital, he presented himself as a legitimate taxi operator who regularly served medical staff, even claiming familiarity with other nurses who supposedly used his services. The sophistication of Ahmad Najib's deception was sufficient to overcome Rohani's well-developed sense of caution, and she entered his vehicle believing she was taking a routine taxi ride home. The GPS data from her mobile phone would later show that Ahmad Najib had driven toward her home for several minutes before diverting to an industrial area where he had prepared for his attack. The premeditation evident in this deviation would become crucial evidence in the eventual prosecution. Rohani's murder represented the culmination of Ahmad Najib's psychological deterioration and the peak of his violent capabilities. The forensic evidence suggested that she had been subjected to the most prolonged and systematic torture of any victim, with the attack lasting several hours before her eventual death. The crime scene analysis revealed that Ahmad Najib had brought additional implements and restraints, indicating that he was now fully committed to maximizing the suffering he could inflict. But Rohani's murder also provided investigators with their most comprehensive collection of physical evidence. The extended duration of the attack had allowed more opportunities for the transfer of trace materials, and Ahmad Najib's increasingly disorganized mental state had caused him to be less careful about evidence disposal. When forensic technicians processed the crime scene, they recovered DNA samples, fiber evidence, and tire impressions that would definitively link the murder to the same perpetrator responsible for the previous killings. The breakthrough in the case came on May 8, 2017, when forensic analysts completed their comparison of DNA evidence collected from all 5 crime scenes. The genetic profile extracted from biological samples found beneath victims' fingernails, on clothing fibers, and at disposal sites all matched a single unknown male perpetrator. When this profile was run through Malaysia's national DNA database, it produced no immediate matches, indicating that the killer had no previous criminal record that required DNA sampling. However, the absence of a database match did not end the DNA investigation. Inspector Razak Hamzah, who had been promoted to lead the special task force, authorized an expanded familial DNA search that would compare the unknown profile to relatives of individuals already in the database. This cutting-edge forensic technique, rarely used in Malaysian investigations at the time, would prove to be the key that finally unlocked Ahmad Najib's identity. The familial search produced a partial match to DNA samples from Ahmad Najib's younger brother, who had been arrested for drug possession 2 years earlier, and was required to provide a DNA sample. The genetic similarities were sufficient to identify Ahmad Najib as a person of interest, and when investigators compared his physical description and vehicle registration to their suspect profile, the match was virtually certain. Surveillance of Ahmad Najib began immediately, with undercover officers monitoring his movements and documenting his behavioral patterns. What they observed was a man whose psychological state had deteriorated to the point where he was no longer capable of maintaining the facade of normalcy that had previously protected him. He was seen driving aimlessly through the city during hours when legitimate taxi drivers would be seeking fares, and his interactions with potential passengers had become so bizarre that several individuals had refused to enter his vehicle. The decision to arrest Ahmad Najib was made on May 12, 2017, when surveillance officers observed him following a young woman who was walking alone near a shopping centre in Subang Jaya. The tactical team moved in before he could make contact with the potential victim, surrounding his vehicle at a traffic light and taking him into custody without incident. The arrest was deliberately low-key to avoid alerting the media and potentially compromising the investigation. Ahmad Najib's initial response to questioning revealed the psychological profile that investigators had constructed from their analysis of the crime scenes. He showed no remorse for his actions and appeared to view his victims as objects rather than human beings. His detailed descriptions of the murders demonstrated a level of psychological detachment that suggested severe antisocial personality disorder, and his apparent pride in the fear he had generated in the community indicated narcissistic tendencies that had been central to his motivation. The search of Ahmad Najib's apartment and vehicle provided the final pieces of evidence needed to secure his conviction. Investigators recovered tools that matched wounds found on victims, restraints that corresponded to ligature marks documented in autopsy reports, and personal items taken from victims as trophies. Most damning was a journal in which Ahmad Najib had documented his fantasies and plans for future attacks, including detailed descriptions of torture methods he wanted to employ. The trial of Ahmad Najib Aris began on September 15, 2017, in the High Court of Malaya, presided over by Justice Dato Mod Arif Mud Yusof. The prosecution, led by Deputy Public Prosecutor Datuk Seri Gopal Sri Ram, presented a case built on overwhelming forensic evidence, eyewitness testimony, and Ahmad Najib's own recorded confessions. The defense, constrained by the strength of the evidence, focused on arguments for diminished mental capacity and the possibility of life imprisonment rather than execution. The testimony of victims' family members provided the most emotionally powerful moments of the trial. Farida, Sharul's widow, testified while holding their infant son, born 3 months after his father's murder. Her description of the impact on her family, delivered in a voice barely above a whisper, reduced many courtroom observers to tears and emphasized the human cost of Ahmad Najib's crimes. Forensic experts testified for days about the evidence linking Ahmad Najib to each murder, with Dr. Siti Aisha Mohammed providing detailed descriptions of the injuries inflicted on victims. Her clinical testimony, delivered with professional detachment, nonetheless conveyed the extreme brutality of the attacks and the prolonged suffering endured by each victim. The judge's visible reaction to the autopsy photographs and forensic evidence suggested that even experienced legal professionals were disturbed by the case's details. The psychological evaluation of Ahmad Najib, conducted by Dr. Fauzia Ibrahim of Hospital Bahagia Ulu Kinta, revealed a complex mental profile that combined antisocial personality disorder with elements of sexual sadism and narcissistic personality disorder. Dr. Fauzia testified that while Ahmad Najib was mentally ill, he retained sufficient cognitive capacity to understand the nature and consequences of his actions, making him legally responsible for his crimes. On November 20, 2017, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all 5 counts of murder. Justice Mod Arif's sentencing statement emphasized the premeditated nature of the crimes, the extreme suffering inflicted on victims, and the terror caused to the broader community. Ahmad Najib was sentenced to death by hanging, a sentence that was carried out on March 15th, 2019, exactly 2 years after his first known murder. The case of Ahmad Najib Aris remains a watershed moment in Malaysian criminal justice, demonstrating both the capabilities of modern forensic science and the persistent challenges of preventing predatory crimes in urban environments. The investigation's success relied heavily on the systematic collection and analysis of physical evidence, particularly DNA profiling and tire impression analysis, techniques that have since become standard in Malaysian murder investigations. The broader impact of the case extended beyond the criminal justice system to influence public safety policies and social awareness of predatory crime. The Royal Malaysia Police implemented new safety protocols for taxi operations, including enhanced background screening and GPS tracking requirements, while public education campaigns emphasized personal safety measures for individuals using transportation services. For the families of Ahmad Najib's victims, the conclusion of his trial provided legal closure, but could never restore what had been lost. The 5 lives taken, Mariam Abdullah, Shahrul Anwar, Lee Wei Ming, Rohani Qasim, and the final victim whose identity was protected at the family's request, represented not just statistics in a criminal case, but individuals whose futures had been violently stolen by one man's descent into ultimate evil. The investigation also revealed systemic issues within Malaysia's transportation industry that may have enabled Ahmad Najib's crimes. The relative ease with which he was able to operate as an unlicensed taxi driver highlighted gaps in regulatory oversight, while his ability to dispose of victims' remains in multiple locations demonstrated the challenges of monitoring vast urban and suburban areas for criminal activity. In the end, the case of Ahmad Najib Aris serves as a sobering reminder of the human capacity for evil and the constant vigilance required to protect society's most vulnerable members. His 6-week reign of terror may have ended with his capture and execution, but the psychological scars left on survivors, families, and the broader community remain as permanent testament to the devastating impact of predatory crime on Malaysian society. The blue Proton Wearer that had served as Ahmad Najib's mobile chamber of horrors was destroyed shortly after the trial's conclusion. But the memory of what it represented continues to influence public perception of urban safety and the hidden dangers that can lurk behind the most mundane facades of daily life. The Angel of Death, Jane Toppin's decade of murder. The morphine slipped into Matty Davis's tea like sugar dissolving in warm water, colourless, odourless, and utterly deadly. As the elderly woman's breathing grew shallow in the oppressive heat of that August afternoon in 1901, Jane Toppin leaned closer, her practice nurse's hands checking the pulse that fluttered like a dying bird's wings. What Mrs. Davis couldn't know, as a consciousness slipped away in her rented cottage in Katamet, Massachusetts, was that the woman she trusted with her life had been perfecting this particular dance of death for over a decade. Jane Toppin would later confess that she derived an almost sexual pleasure from these moments, holding her victims as they died, watching the light fade from their eyes, feeling the final shudder of life leaving their bodies. "This is my ambition," she would tell investigators with chilling matter-of-factness. "To have killed more people, more helpless people, than any other man or woman who ever lived." By the time authorities finally stopped her in 1901, Jane Toppin had achieved her macabre goal, claiming at least 31 lives across a 10-year killing spree that would earn her the moniker Jolly Jane for her deceptively cheerful demeanour. But the path to becoming America's most prolific female serial killer began long before she ever held a syringe in the squalid tenements of Boston's Irish immigrant community, where a young girl named Honora Kelly learned that survival often required wearing masks. The year 1857 found 8-year-old Honora standing in the corridors of the Boston Female Asylum, her small frame trembling, not from cold, but from the profound abandonment that had deposited her there. Her father, Peter Kelly, had surrendered both Honora and her sister Delia to the asylum's care, unable or unwilling to manage the burden of raising daughters in a city that offered little mercy to Irish immigrants. The records from that October day paint a stark picture. 2 young girls, essentially orphaned by poverty and circumstance, thrust into an institutional system that would shape their understanding of human worth and disposability. What made Honora's case particularly tragic was not just the abandonment itself, but the manner of it. Peter Kelly had been struggling with what contemporary accounts describe as mental instability, though whether this was genuine psychological illness or the breakdown of a man overwhelmed by grief and economic desperation remains unclear. What is documented is that he had attempted to poison himself and his daughters with laudanum before surrendering them to the asylum. The failed murder-suicide attempt left an indelible mark on young Honora's psyche, introducing her to the concept that life could be ended by a caring hand administering medicine. The Boston Female Asylum, despite its charitable mission, was a harsh environment where children learned to suppress their emotional needs and present themselves as useful, agreeable, and above all, grateful. Honora excelled at this performance, developing what staff members noted as an unusually cheerful disposition that masked whatever turmoil churned beneath. She was, by all accounts, a model child, helpful, obedient, and possessed of an almost preternatural ability to anticipate the needs of others. In 1860, at age 11, Honora's life took a dramatic turn when she was placed with the Toppen family of Lowell, Massachusetts. Anne and Otis Toppen were a well-regarded couple who had taken in several children from the asylum, though they had never formally adopted any of them. The Toppens provided Honora with something she had never experienced: stability, education, and a glimpse into the comfortable middle-class life that existed beyond the tenements of her birth. Otis Toppen was a successful tailor who had built a respectable business in Lowell, and Anne Toppen was known for her charitable works and involvement in local church activities. They renamed the girl Jane Toppen, though never legally adopted her, a detail that would prove psychologically significant, as it left her in a perpetual state of conditional belonging. The Toppen household operated on strict moral principles, with emphasis placed on propriety, hard work, and the importance of maintaining appearances in polite society. Jane thrived in this environment, at least superficially. She attended school regularly, displayed an aptitude for learning, and seemed to relish the opportunity to shed her origins as an abandoned Irish orphan. But those closest to her began to notice troubling patterns in her behaviour. She displayed an unusual fascination with illness and death, often lingering at the bedsides of sick neighbours, with an intensity that made adults uncomfortable. More disturbing were reports from other children that Jane would sometimes act out elaborate scenarios involving death and dying, always casting herself as the caring attendant who would comfort the dying. The Toppen family's other foster children later recalled that Jane seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to know when someone was about to become ill. She would arrive at their bedside with medicines and remedies before symptoms had even manifested, leading some to joke that she had a sixth sense about sickness. What they didn't understand was that Jane was not predicting illness. She was creating it. By her late teens, Jane had developed into a striking young woman with dark hair, piercing blue eyes, and a vivacious personality that drew people to her. She was known throughout Lowell as Jolly Jane for her infectious laugh and seemingly boundless energy. She had also begun to display a sophisticated understanding of social dynamics, intuiting exactly what people wanted to hear and reflecting it back to them with uncanny accuracy. This chameleon-like quality would serve her well in her chosen profession, though those who knew her best sometimes commented that they felt they never quite knew the real Jane beneath the performance. The transition from foster child to professional caregiver seemed natural for Jane. In 1885, at age 26, she enrolled in the Cambridge Hospital Training School for Nurses, one of the first formal nursing programs in Massachusetts. The profession of nursing was experiencing a renaissance in late 19th century America, driven by the pioneering work of Florence Nightingale and the growing recognition that trained nurses could significantly improve patient outcomes. For Jane, nursing represented not just a career, but a legitimate outlet for her long-standing fascination with death and dying. Her nursing training began at Cambridge Hospital, where she quickly distinguished herself as an exceptional student. Instructors noted her dedication, her gentle bedside manner, and her remarkable ability to comfort patients during their final moments. What they didn't realize was that Jane was conducting a different kind of experiment altogether. She had discovered that she could manipulate patient outcomes through the careful administration of medications, and that she derived an intense psychological gratification from controlling the moment of death. The medical knowledge Jane acquired during her training provided her with the tools to kill efficiently and undetectably. She learned about the properties of various drugs, how to calculate dosages, and most importantly, how to mask the symptoms of poisoning as natural death. Morphine became her weapon of choice, partly because it was readily available in hospital settings, and partly because it allowed her to create the kind of peaceful, controlled death that satisfied her psychological needs. Her first confirmed kill came in 1887, though Jane would later claim that she had been experimenting with lethal doses of medication from the beginning of her nursing career. The victim was an elderly patient at Cambridge Hospital, a man whose death was attributed to his advanced age and poor health. Jane had volunteered to sit with him during his final hours, a gesture that was praised by supervisors as evidence of her compassionate nature. What they didn't know was that Jane had administered a lethal dose of morphine and then held the man as he died, experiencing what she would later describe as an intense rush of power and sexual excitement. The pattern was established. Jane would identify vulnerable patients, gain their trust, and then kill them with carefully calculated doses of poison. She became expert at reading the family dynamics around dying patients, positioning herself as the devoted caregiver who could ease their loved one's passing. Her victims died peacefully, often with Jane holding their hand or stroking their hair, creating touching deathbed scenes that left families grateful for her presence during their darkest hours. After completing her training, Jane took a position at Massachusetts General Hospital, where her reputation as an exceptional nurse continued to grow. Colleagues admired her stamina, her willingness to work the most difficult shifts, and her particular skill with terminal patients. She seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to predict when a patient was about to die, often arriving at their bedside moments before the end, with remarkable consistency. The hospital setting provided Jane with perfect cover for her activities. Deaths were expected, autopsies were rare, and the medical establishment of the 1890s had limited understanding of toxicology. Jane exploited these weaknesses systematically, carefully selecting victims who were already ill or elderly, ensuring that their deaths would appear natural. She also began to develop a more sophisticated understanding of how different poisons affected the body, experimenting with various combinations and dosages to achieve the desired effects. Her victims during this period included both patients and fellow staff members. Jane had a particular talent for befriending lonely, isolated individuals who had few people to notice their decline or question their deaths. She would insert herself into their lives, offering companionship and care, gradually increasing their dependence on her before ultimately killing them. The process could take weeks or months, during which Jane would savor the growing trust and affection of her intended victims. In 1889, Jane was dismissed from Massachusetts General Hospital under circumstances that remain somewhat unclear. Official records cite personality conflicts with other staff members, but contemporary accounts suggest that some physicians had become suspicious of the unusually high mortality rate among Jane's patients. Rather than face a formal investigation, Jane was quietly allowed to resign, a decision that would prove tragically short-sighted. The dismissal might have ended Jane's killing spree, but instead, it simply moved her operations to a different venue. She began working as a private nurse, a role that provided her with even greater access to vulnerable victims and less oversight from medical authorities. Private nursing was a growing field in the 1890s, as wealthy families sought trained professionals to care for sick relatives in their homes. Jane's reputation as a skilled and dedicated nurse made her highly sought after, and she commanded premium rates for her services. Her private nursing career took her into the homes of Boston's most prominent families, where she quickly established herself as indispensable. She had perfected the art of making herself invaluable to her employers, anticipating their needs, managing household crises, and presenting herself as the solution to their problems. Families often requested her specifically when they had a seriously ill relative, not knowing that they were essentially hiring their loved one's executioner. The Davis family of Calumet, Massachusetts, first encountered Jane Topham in the summer of 1901 when they hired her to care for Mattie Davis, the elderly matriarch of the family. Mattie had been struggling with various health issues, and her family felt that professional nursing care would help her recover. Jane arrived at the Davis cottage with impeccable credentials and a warm, reassuring manner that immediately put the family at ease. What followed was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Jane quickly ingratiated herself with the entire Davis family, making herself indispensable not just as a nurse, but as a trusted confidant and advisor. She demonstrated an uncanny ability to anticipate the family's needs, often arriving with solutions to problems they hadn't even articulated yet. The Davises came to view Jane as a godsend, a skilled professional who could manage their mother's care while providing emotional support to the entire family. But Jane had identified the Davis family as more than just another client. They represented the culmination of her decade-long killing spree. She had grown increasingly bold in her methods and increasingly hungry for the psychological satisfaction that came from controlling life and death. The isolated cottage in Calumet provided the perfect setting for what would become her most audacious series of murders. Mattie Davis died on July 31, 1901, after several weeks of declining health under Jane's care. The death appeared natural, the result of the elderly woman's various ailments, and the family was grateful for Jane's compassionate care during their mother's final days. But Jane wasn't finished with the Davis family. She had discovered that she could extend her stay by targeting other family members, creating a cascade of deaths that would allow her to maintain her position as the family's caregiver. Her next target was Alden Davis, Mattie's son, who had hired Jane to care for his mother. Jane began slipping small amounts of poison into his food and drink, causing him to become increasingly ill. As his condition worsened, Jane positioned herself as his primary caregiver, expressing concern about his symptoms while secretly increasing the dosages. Alden Davis died on August 8, 1901, just over a week after his mother's death. The double tragedy devastated the Davis family, but Jane's presence provided comfort during their grief. She had become so integral to their lives that they couldn't imagine managing without her. She attended both funerals, comforted the survivors, and helped manage the practical arrangements that followed the deaths. To the Davis family and their neighbours, Jane Topham appeared to be an angel of mercy, a selfless caregiver who had done everything possible to save their loved ones. But Jane's appetite for death had not been satisfied. She next targeted Alden's wife, Mary, and their daughter, Genevieve Foster. Using the same methods that had proven successful with Mattie and Alden, Jane began systematically poisoning both women. The process was more complex this time, as she had to manage multiple victims simultaneously while maintaining her facade of caring professionalism. Mary Davis became ill first, displaying symptoms that Jane attributed to grief and exhaustion from the recent deaths. As Mary's condition worsened, Jane took on even greater responsibility for the household, essentially becoming the family's caretaker. She managed the daily routines, prepared meals, and administered medications with the authority of a trained medical professional. The family's trust in her was absolute, and they followed her recommendations without question. Genevieve Foster, who had come to help care for her ill mother, soon began displaying similar symptoms. Jane explained that the family was likely experiencing a form of food poisoning, or perhaps a contagious illness that had weakened their immune systems. She increased her vigilance, preparing special meals and administering remedies that she claimed would help them recover. In reality, she was carefully calibrating the doses of poison to create the maximum psychological impact while maintaining plausible deniability. The deaths of Mary Davis and Genevieve Foster in September 1901 finally aroused suspicion. 4 deaths in one family within the span of 2 months was unusual, even considering the limited medical knowledge of the era. Dr. Leonard Wood, who had been treating some of the Davis family members, began to question the circumstances surrounding their deaths. He had noticed that the symptoms displayed by the victims were consistent with poisoning, though he had initially attributed them to natural causes given the victims' apparent poor health. The investigation that followed would reveal the full scope of Jane Toppin's crimes. When authorities exhumed the bodies of the Davis family members, they found significant amounts of morphine and atropine in their tissues, conclusive evidence of poisoning. The discovery led to Jane's arrest on October 29, 1901, ending her decade-long killing spree. The interrogation of Jane Toppin became a study in criminal psychology that would influence the understanding of serial killers for decades to come. Initially, Jane denied any wrongdoing, maintaining her facade of innocent professionalism. But as the evidence mounted, she began to reveal the true scope of her crimes. The confessions that followed were both comprehensive and deeply disturbing, providing investigators with a detailed account of her methods, motivations, and victims. Jane admitted to killing at least 31 people, though she hinted that the actual number might be higher. She described her killings with clinical detachment, explaining how she had selected her victims, calculated the dosages, and managed the aftermath. Most shocking was her admission that she had derived sexual pleasure from the act of killing, describing how she would hold her victims as they died and experience intense psychological gratification from controlling their final moments. The trial of Jane Toppin began in June 1902, attracting national attention as one of the first high-profile serial killer cases in American history. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of her guilt, including toxicology reports, witness testimony, and Jane's own confessions. The defense strategy focused on proving insanity, arguing that no rational person could commit such heinous crimes without being mentally ill. The insanity defense proved successful, largely due to Jane's own testimony about her motivations and psychological state. She described her crimes with such disturbing matter-of-factness that it became clear she was fundamentally different from normal human beings. The jury found her not guilty by reason of insanity, and she was committed to the Taunton Insane Hospital, where she would spend the rest of her life. Jane Toppin's case marked a turning point in American criminal justice, highlighting the need for better oversight of medical professionals and more sophisticated understanding of serial killers. Her crimes exposed weaknesses in the healthcare system that allowed a single individual to kill dozens of people over a decade without detection. The case also contributed to the development of forensic toxicology and the establishment of protocols for investigating suspicious deaths. The psychological profile that emerged from Jane's case would influence criminal psychology for generations. Her ability to maintain a facade of normalcy while systematically killing people, demonstrated the complexity of psychopathic behavior. She showed no remorse for her crimes, no empathy for her victims, and no understanding of why her actions were wrong. Yet she had been able to function successfully in society for decades, earning the trust and affection of countless people who never suspected her true nature. Jane Toppan died at the Taunton State Hospital on August 17, 1938, at the age of 84, having spent the final 36 years of her life in confinement. Even in the hospital, she maintained her cheerful demeanour, becoming a favourite among staff members who appreciated her helpful nature and apparent stability. She never expressed remorse for her crimes, never showed signs of mental illness beyond her fundamental lack of empathy, and never provided a satisfactory explanation for why she had killed so many innocent people. The legacy of Jane Toppan extends far beyond her individual crimes. Her case helped establish the modern understanding of serial killers as individuals who are capable of appearing normal while harboring deep psychological abnormalities. It demonstrated the need for better screening of healthcare professionals and more sophisticated methods of detecting medical murders. Most importantly, it served as a warning about the potential for evil to hide behind a facade of care and compassion. The victims of Jane Toppan, 31 confirmed dead, possibly more, represent a cross-section of late 19th century American society. They were patients seeking healing, families trusting a caregiver with their most vulnerable members, and communities that believed in the fundamental goodness of those who chose to dedicate their lives to helping others. Their deaths served as a stark reminder that trust, while essential to human society, can be exploited by those who view other people not as fellow human beings, but as objects to be manipulated and destroyed. In the end, Jane Toppan achieved her stated ambition of becoming one of history's most prolific killers. But the cost of that achievement was measured not just in the lives she took, but in the trust she betrayed, the families she destroyed, and the innocence she shattered. Her story remains a chilling reminder that the capacity for evil can exist behind the most benevolent facades, and that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear to be our protectors. The surgeon's shadow, the Mikhail Novosyolov murders. The fluorescent lights of Izhevsk City Hospital cast their familiar harsh glow across the emergency ward on the night of March 15, 1995, when Dr. Mikhail Novosyolov made his final rounds. To his colleagues, the 34-year-old surgeon appeared, as he always did, methodical, precise, utterly professional. His white coat was immaculate, his surgical instruments properly sterilized and arranged with the obsessive care that had made him one of the most respected physicians in the Udmurt Republic. What none of them could have imagined was that beneath this veneer of medical dedication lurked one of Russia's most calculating serial killers, a man who had spent nearly 2 decades transforming his healing knowledge into an instrument of death. The irony would not be lost on investigators when they finally pieced together the full scope of Novosyolov's crimes. Here was a man sworn to the Hippocratic Oath, trained to preserve life at all costs, who had systematically murdered at least 22 people between 1977 and 1995. His victims ranged from elderly patients under his care to homeless individuals he encountered on Izhevsk's darkened streets. Each killing demonstrated not just a profound psychological pathology, but a chilling perversion of medical expertise that allowed him to kill with methods so subtle, so clinically precise, that many deaths went undetected for years. The story of Mikhail Novosyolov begins not in the sterile corridors of a modern hospital, but in the industrial heartland of the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War. Born in 1961 in Izhevsk, a city synonymous with weapons manufacturing and military production, Novosyolov came of age in an environment shaped by rigid authoritarianism and the cult of technical precision that defined Soviet society. Izhevsk, located nearly 1,000 kilometers east of Moscow, was a closed city during much of the Soviet era, its factories producing everything from the famous Kalashnikov rifle to precision machinery for the military-industrial complex. The young Novoselov displayed an early fascination with both medicine and death that should have raised red flags. But in the context of Soviet society's emphasis on scientific achievement and technical mastery, his interests were channeled into medical studies. Former classmates would later describe him as unnaturally calm around cadavers during anatomy classes, showing none of the squeamishness typical of first-year medical students. Instead, he approached dissection with what professors remembered as an almost artistic appreciation for the mechanics of mortality. His academic record was exemplary. Novoselov graduated from the Izhevsk State Medical Institute in 1983 with specializations in surgery and emergency medicine. His thesis, focusing on trauma response and resuscitation techniques, demonstrated both technical brilliance and an unsettling fascination with the precise moments when life transitions to death. Dr. Elena Kuznetsova, who served on his thesis committee, would later tell investigators that she remembered feeling disturbed by his almost romantic descriptions of patient mortality, but dismissed her concerns as academic overthinking. The early years of Novoselov's medical career coincided with the final chaotic decade of the Soviet Union. As the communist system began its inexorable collapse, institutions throughout the USSR experienced profound instability. Hospitals were understaffed, undersupplied, and increasingly overwhelmed by social problems, alcoholism, drug addiction, homelessness, that the Soviet system had long denied existed. For a killer like Novoselov, this institutional breakdown created perfect hunting conditions. His first confirmed murder occurred in September 1977, though investigators believe he may have been killing even earlier. The victim was Ivan Petrov, a 67-year-old factory worker admitted to Izhevsk City Hospital following a minor industrial accident. Petrov's injuries were not life-threatening, a broken arm and minor lacerations, but during his overnight stay for observation, something went catastrophically wrong. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, not uncommon for a man of Petrov's age with a history of heart problems. What made this death suspicious in retrospect was Novoselov's presence in Petrov's room at the time of death, and the discovery years later of puncture marks on the victim's body consistent with injections of potassium chloride, a substance that could cause cardiac arrest while leaving minimal forensic evidence. Potassium chloride would become Novoselov's signature method, though he demonstrated a disturbing versatility in his killing techniques. As an emergency room physician, he had ready access to a pharmacy's worth of deadly substances, succinylcholine, which causes paralysis and respiratory failure, digoxin, which can trigger fatal heart arrhythmias, and insulin, which in massive doses can cause fatal hypoglycemic shock. Each substance, when administered properly, could mimic natural causes of death, especially in elderly or already compromised patients. The genius of Novoselov's approach lay not just in his choice of murder weapons, but in his selection of victims. He targeted individuals whose deaths would attract minimal scrutiny: elderly patients with existing health problems, homeless individuals with no family to ask questions, alcoholics whose bodies were already failing. In the chaotic healthcare system of late Soviet and early post-Soviet Russia, where medical records were often incomplete and autopsies were rarely performed, except in cases of obvious foul play, Novoselov's crimes disappeared into bureaucratic indifference. Throughout the 1980s, his killing pattern established itself with terrifying consistency. Hospital records from this period, later analyzed by investigators, show an unusual statistical anomaly. Patients under Novoselov's direct care experienced mortality rates significantly higher than those treated by his colleagues. The difference was subtle enough to escape notice during routine quality reviews, but dramatic enough to represent dozens of excess deaths over the course of a decade. Maria Volkov's death in February 1983 exemplified Novosiolov's methodical approach. The 71-year-old widow had been admitted to the hospital's cardiac unit following chest pains that proved to be anxiety-related rather than indicative of heart disease. Her condition was stable, her prognosis excellent. She was scheduled for discharge the following morning. Instead, she died during the night shift, with Novosiolov the last medical professional to see her alive. The death certificate listed acute myocardial infarction as the cause, and Volkov was buried 3 days later with no autopsy performed. What investigators would later discover was that Novosiolov had developed a sophisticated understanding of forensic medicine that allowed him to kill with near impunity. He knew exactly which substances would be detected in standard toxicology screens and which would dissipate from the body too quickly to be traced. He understood the bureaucratic patterns of his hospital well enough to know when autopsies would and wouldn't be ordered. Most crucially, he had cultivated a reputation for clinical excellence that made colleagues reluctant to question his judgment or review his cases too closely. The killer's psychological profile, reconstructed years later through extensive interviews and psychiatric evaluation, revealed a classic case of what forensic psychologists term malignant narcissism with medical authority complex. Novosiolov derived profound satisfaction from exercising absolute power over life and death. But unlike many serial killers, his gratification came not from the act of killing itself, but from the intellectual challenge of committing perfect murders. He saw himself as engaged in a complex game against society's investigative institutions, with each undetected death representing a victory for his superior intellect. Former colleagues described him as arrogant, but not obviously dangerous. Dr. Alexei Romanov, who worked alongside Novosiolov for nearly a decade, later told investigators that the killer displayed an almost godlike complex about his role as a physician. He would make comments about having the power to decide who lived and who died. But we all assumed he was speaking metaphorically about the pressures of emergency medicine. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 created new opportunities for Novosiolov's crimes. As Russia's social safety net disintegrated and homelessness became a visible problem even in previously stable cities like Izhevsk, the killer began expanding his victim selection beyond hospital patients. Street people who sought medical attention at the emergency room became targets of opportunity. These individuals, lacking family connections or social status, could disappear entirely without generating missing person reports or investigative attention. Viktor Smirnov's murder in November 1992 marked this evolution in Novosiolov's methodology. Smirnov, a 45-year-old construction worker who had lost his job and apartment during the economic chaos following the USSR's collapse, had been living rough on Izhevsk's streets. When he arrived at the hospital emergency room suffering from hypothermia and alcohol poisoning, he encountered Novosiolov during the night shift. Hospital records show that Smirnov was treated for his immediate symptoms and was stabilizing nicely. His blood alcohol level was elevated but not fatal, his body temperature was returning to normal, and his vital signs were improving. Yet Smirnov died during the early morning hours, officially from complications related to acute alcohol poisoning. His body was released to the municipal morgue and, with no family to claim it, was buried in an unmarked grave in the city's Potter's Field. What investigators would later determine was that Novosiolov had administered a lethal injection of insulin, causing fatal hypoglycemic shock that mimicked the symptoms of severe alcohol poisoning. The insulin, naturally present in the human body, left no forensic trace that would have been detected in a routine autopsy, if an autopsy had even been performed. Throughout this period, Novosiolov maintained the facade of a dedicated medical professional. He published papers in medical journals, attended conferences, and was even honored by the Udmurt Republic's health ministry for his contributions to emergency medicine. Photographs from hospital functions show him accepting awards and recognition, his expression displaying the satisfied confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. The killer's personal life during this period remained remarkably mundane. He lived alone in a modest apartment near the hospital, maintained few close friendships, and showed little interest in romantic relationships. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, and unremarkable. His only notable hobby was an extensive collection of medical textbooks and journals which filled every room of his apartment. When investigators eventually searched the apartment, they discovered that many of these books contained detailed annotations about lethal dosages, forensic detection methods, and post-mortem toxicology, a library of murder masquerading as professional development. The beginning of the end for Novoselov came not through brilliant detective work or forensic breakthroughs, but through the persistent suspicions of a single nurse who had worked with him for years. Svetlana Kozlova, a veteran emergency room nurse, had noticed the statistical anomaly in patient deaths during Novoselov's shifts years before anyone in hospital administration paid attention. Her concerns were initially dismissed as professional jealousy or stress-related paranoia, but Kozlova continued documenting cases and maintaining her own unofficial records. The case that finally broke open the investigation involved 19-year-old Anna Fedorova, a university student who had been brought to the emergency room in March 1995 following a minor car accident. Fedorova's injuries were superficial, cuts and bruises that required cleaning and bandaging, but no significant medical intervention. She was young, healthy, and in good spirits, joking with nurses about missing her evening classes. Her parents had been contacted and were driving to the hospital to pick her up. Instead, Anna Fedorova died suddenly during what should have been a routine overnight observation. The official cause of death was listed as an undiagnosed cardiac condition, but Kozlova's suspicions were finally taken seriously when the victim's parents demanded a full investigation. Unlike the homeless individuals and elderly patients who had comprised most of Novoselov's victims, Fedorova came from a prominent local family with the resources and social connections to demand answers. The autopsy, performed by the region's chief medical examiner, revealed the presence of succinylcholine in Fedorova's system, a paralytic agent that would have caused respiratory failure while leaving the victim conscious and aware of her impending death. The discovery triggered a massive investigation that quickly expanded to encompass Novoselov's entire career. Hospital records going back to 1977 were reviewed, statistical analyses were performed, and patterns that had been invisible to individual observation became glaringly obvious under systematic scrutiny. The mortality rate for patients under Novoselov's direct care was more than 400% higher than the hospital average. Deaths consistently occurred during night shifts when fewer witnesses were present. Victims shared common characteristics: advanced age, social isolation, or conditions that made their deaths seem plausible from natural causes. The investigation, led by Detective Captain Boris Petrov of the Udmurt Republic's Criminal Investigation Department, expanded to include forensic accountants, medical examiners, and criminal psychologists. What they uncovered was a killing spree of unprecedented sophistication and duration. At least 22 murders could be definitively attributed to Novoselov, with investigators suspecting the actual number was significantly higher. Exhumation orders were obtained for victims whose bodies could be located and whose remains might still contain forensic evidence. The results were horrifying. Body after body showed evidence of lethal injections, toxic substances, or other medical interventions that could not be explained by legitimate treatment protocols. The investigation revealed that Novoselov had essentially transformed one of Izhevsk's primary medical facilities into his personal killing ground, operating with impunity for nearly 2 decades. The arrest came on March 20th, 1995, as Novoselov was beginning his evening shift at the hospital. Detective Captain Petrov and a team of investigators waited until the killer was in the emergency room, surrounded by the medical equipment and institutional setting that had enabled his crimes. Witnesses described Novoselov's reaction as eerily calm, almost relieved. He offered no resistance, made no protestations of innocence, and seemed genuinely curious about how investigators had finally discovered his methods. During interrogation, Novoselov displayed the clinical detachment that had characterized his murders. He described his crimes with the same methodical precision he had once applied to legitimate medical procedures, discussing dosages, injection sites, and timing with the dispassionate tone of a professor delivering a lecture. When asked about his motivations, he spoke about the intellectual satisfaction of solving complex problems and the godlike power of controlling life and death. Each death was a puzzle, he told investigators during one recorded interview. How to achieve the desired result while avoiding detection, how to select appropriate subjects, how to exploit institutional weaknesses. It was the most challenging intellectual exercise of my career. The trial of Mikhail Novoselov began in September 1995 and became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in post-Soviet Russian history. The prosecution, led by regional prosecutor Vladimir Kuznetsov, presented evidence that painted a picture of systematic murder carried out over 18 years. Medical experts testified about the sophisticated knowledge required to commit such crimes, while hospital administrators were forced to acknowledge the institutional failures that had allowed the killings to continue undetected. The defense, led by attorney Elena Morozova, attempted an insanity plea, arguing that Novoselov suffered from severe mental illness that prevented him from understanding the nature of his actions. A panel of psychiatrists examined the defendant extensively, ultimately concluding that while he displayed clear signs of personality disorders and narcissistic pathology, he was legally sane and fully aware of the criminality of his actions. Victim impact statements provided the most emotionally powerful moments of the trial. Family members of identified victims spoke about their loved ones' final days, their trust in the medical system, and their devastation upon learning that someone sworn to heal had instead chosen to kill. Anna Fedorova's parents delivered particularly moving testimony, describing their daughter's dreams of becoming a teacher and their ongoing struggle to understand how a routine hospital visit had become a death sentence. Throughout the proceedings, Novoselov showed little emotion or remorse. He answered questions directly and without apparent shame, occasionally correcting technical details in the prosecution's presentation of evidence. When asked if he felt guilt about his victims, he responded that he felt professional pride in the technical execution of complex procedures. The verdict, delivered on December 15, 1995, was guilty on all 22 counts of murder. Judge Alexander Volkov, in delivering the sentence, noted that the case represented an unprecedented betrayal of medical ethics and human trust. Novoselov was sentenced to death, though this sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment following Russia's moratorium on capital punishment. The aftermath of the Novoselov case triggered widespread reforms in Russian medical institutions. Hospitals implemented new monitoring systems for controlled substances, created oversight protocols for high mortality cases, and established psychological screening procedures for medical personnel. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of marginalized populations, the elderly, homeless, and socially isolated, to predatory behavior within institutional settings. Medical ethicists and criminal psychologists continue to study the Novoselov case as an example of how professional authority can be corrupted for criminal purposes. His crimes represented not just individual pathology, but institutional failures that allowed systematic murder to continue undetected for nearly 2 decades. The case has become required study in medical ethics programs throughout Russia and has influenced international protocols for monitoring suspicious deaths in healthcare settings. Mikhail Novosyolov remains incarcerated in a maximum security facility in the Perm region, where he has become something of a scholar of criminal psychology, corresponding with researchers and occasionally granting interviews to criminologists studying medical serial killers. Now in his 60s, he continues to display the same clinical detachment that characterized his crimes, discussing his murders as if they were case studies rather than the destruction of human lives. The victims of Mikhail Novosyolov, 22, confirmed, possibly many more, represented a cross-section of Russian society during one of its most turbulent periods. They were elderly factory workers who had built the Soviet industrial machine, homeless individuals discarded by economic transition, young people like Anna Fedorova, whose futures were stolen by a killer's narcissistic games. Their deaths, initially invisible within the chaos of a collapsing social system, ultimately exposed fundamental truths about institutional accountability, professional ethics, and the vulnerability of those who place their trust in systems designed to protect them. The case of the surgeon's shadow remains one of Russia's most chilling criminal investigations, a reminder that the greatest monsters often hide behind the most respected facades, using society's most sacred trusts as weapons against the innocent.